Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The dirt road that cut through the eastern edge of the San Carlos Apache Reservation had no official name on any map that Elridge Koa had ever seen, but the locals called it Dust Devil Trail, for reasons that became obvious during the dry months when the wind picked up and turned the unpaved surface into a churning tunnel of red sand that could reduce visibility to nothing in seconds. It was late June, and the temperature had been hovering above 105 degrees for the better part of 2 weeks, baking the high desert landscape into something that looked more like the surface of another planet than any part of Arizona that tourists saw in their glossy brochures. The mesquite trees stood twisted and skeletal against the pale sky, their shadows offering no real relief from the heat that radiated up from the ground in visible waves, and the air itself had taken on a quality that made breathing feel like work, each inhalation pulling in warmth that settled in the lungs and refused to leave. Elridge had been patrolling the eastern boundary of the reservation for 6 years, long enough to know every wash and arroyo, every abandoned homestead and hunting camp, every place where the tribal land pressed up against the borders of Greenlee County, and the jurisdiction became complicated in ways that outsiders never fully understood. The reservation wasn't a sealed territory with gates and checkpoints. It was porous and overlapping, a patchwork of treaty land and trust land and private holdings that created jurisdictional gray zones where tribal police and county sheriffs and federal agents all claimed authority, but none wanted full responsibility. It was in these boundary zones that things happened, things that fell through the cracks between agencies that didn't communicate well and didn't trust each other, and were often working with budgets so thin that thoroughness became a luxury they couldn't afford. The call had come through dispatch just after 2 in the afternoon, the voice of Yolanda at the station crackling through his radio with the flat, professional tone she used when something was wrong, but not yet an emergency. A missing child report from the Morrison Canyon camping area. A boy who'd wandered away from his family's site sometime during the previous evening and hadn't been found despite several hours of searching by family members and other campers. The family was non-tribal, visitors from Tucson who'd driven up for a weekend of hiking and hadn't understood that the reservation backcountry wasn't like the maintained campgrounds they were probably used to. Out here, the desert could swallow a person in minutes, especially a child, and the chances of survival decreased exponentially with each hour that passed under a sun that showed no mercy to the unprepared. Elridge acknowledged the call and turned his patrol truck onto the network of rough tracks that led toward Morrison Canyon, feeling the suspension protest as the vehicle bounced over ruts and stones that the last monsoon season had left behind. The canyon wasn't technically on reservation land. It sat just outside the boundary in what was classified as national forest. But the access roads all ran through tribal territory, and the informal agreement between the Apache police and the Forest Service was that whoever responded first took point, with the understanding that backup would come from wherever it was available. He'd worked missing person cases before, more than he wanted to count, and they fell into recognizable patterns. Most of the time, children who wandered off were found within a few hours, scared and dehydrated but alive, usually not far from where they'd disappeared. But there were exceptions, cases where the search stretched into days and ended with discoveries that nobody wanted to make. And Elridge had learned to approach each case with the same methodical care, while hoping for the best and preparing mentally for the worst. The camping area appeared through the heat shimmer like a mirage, a cluster of tents and vehicles arranged in the informal pattern that car campers used when they wanted to feel like they were roughing it without giving up too many comforts. Elridge counted 5 separate campsites, 4 of them showing signs of occupation with camping gear and coolers visible, and one that looked abandoned with the tent still standing but no vehicle nearby. The family that had reported the missing child was easy to identify: a man and woman in their 30s standing near a newer model SUV with out-of-state plates, their body language radiating the particular kind of controlled panic that parents displayed when something was seriously wrong, but they were trying to hold themselves together for the sake of appearing rational to authorities. He parked the patrol truck in a position that would be visible from the access road in case other responders arrived, and stepped out into heat that hit him like a physical wall, despite having driven through it for the past 40 minutes. The air smelled of creosote and dust, and the faint chemical tang of camp stoves that had been used to cook breakfast hours earlier. The woman saw him first and started walking in his direction with quick strides that suggested she'd been waiting for official help and was relieved it had finally arrived, while the man stayed near the vehicle talking on a cell phone that probably had minimal signal, but was still better than nothing when you were desperate for any connection to the outside world. Her name was Marina Tala, and she introduced herself with a handshake that was too firm and too long, holding on as though physical contact with someone in uniform would somehow make the situation more manageable. She was medium height, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had come loose in places, wearing hiking clothes that were expensive but not broken in, the kind of outdoor gear that people bought for occasional weekend adventures rather than serious backcountry use. Her eyes were red-rimmed in a way that suggested she'd been crying earlier, but had stopped because there was work to be done and breaking down wouldn't help find her son. When she spoke, her voice had the slightly too fast quality of someone running on adrenaline and fear, the words coming out in bursts that she had to consciously slow down to make coherent. Her son's name was David. He was 8 years old, and he'd been missing since approximately 9 o'clock the previous evening, when he'd asked to use the bathroom, and walked away from the campsite toward the designated facilities that were located about 200 yards down the main trail. The family had been cooking dinner and hadn't been worried when he didn't return immediately, assuming he'd stopped to look at something interesting or had met other campers and started talking. But when 15 minutes passed and then 20, Marina's husband had gone to check and found the bathroom area empty with no sign of David. They'd searched the immediate area first, calling his name and checking obvious places where a child might have wandered, then expanded the search to include other campsites and the network of hiking trails that radiated out from the camping area into the surrounding canyon lands. Other campers had joined the search as word spread, forming small groups that covered different directions while maintaining visual contact and periodically regrouping to share information. They'd searched through the night using flashlights and headlamps, following trails and checking washes and calling David's name until their voices were hoarse. As dawn broke, they'd expanded the search further, some groups hiking several miles into the canyon system while others drove the access roads looking for any sign that David might have somehow made it back to a main road. But there had been nothing. No tracks or discarded clothing or any of the other signs that search and rescue teams looked for when trying to trace a missing person's movements. Elridge listened without interrupting, making mental notes about timeline and search patterns that had already been covered, calculating how many hours had passed and what that meant for a child's survival prospects in this heat. 41 hours since David had last been seen, which meant he'd been through one full night and was now well into his second day of exposure. If he'd found shade and stayed still, if he had any water with him, or had been smart enough to recognize edible plants or find moisture in barrel cactus, he might still be alive. But those were a lot of ifs, and Elridge had learned not to build hope on them. He asked the questions that procedure required, gathering information that would be needed when other agencies arrived, and the search became formalized with designated sectors and coordinated sweeps. What had David been wearing? Blue t-shirt, khaki shorts, running shoes that were relatively new and might not have adequate tread for rough terrain. Did he have any medical conditions? No, healthy and active. No medications or allergies that would complicate things. Had he ever wandered off before? Once, at a shopping mall 2 years ago, found within 10 minutes in a toy store. Was there any reason to think this might not be an accidental wandering? Marina's face had tightened at that question, and Elridge saw the moment when she understood what he was really asking, whether there might be custody issues or family problems that would suggest David had run away, or been taken rather than simply getting lost. She answered carefully, explaining that she and her husband were divorced but maintained a cordial relationship, that David split time between households without apparent distress, that there were no custody disputes or protective orders or any of the other red flags that complicated missing child cases. The camping trip had been her scheduled time with David, just the two of them, and her ex-husband was already driving up from Tucson after she'd called him with the news. Everything in her explanation sounded straightforward and reasonable, the kind of modern family arrangement that was common enough not to raise immediate suspicion. But Elridge noted the details anyway, because experience had taught him that initial statements didn't always match what investigations eventually revealed. He walked the area where David had last been seen, noting the terrain and vegetation and the multiple routes a child could have taken from the bathroom facilities. The designated trails were obvious enough, marked with worn paths and occasional cairns that hikers had built over the years. But there were also game trails and erosion channels and countless other routes that would look navigable to a child who didn't understand how quickly the desert could become a maze. The ground was hardpan and rock, not ideal for tracking, and any footprints that might have been left the previous evening had likely been obscured by the searching parties that had covered the same ground repeatedly through the night. The campsite itself was unremarkable. A standard family setup with a 6-person tent, camping chairs arranged around a fire ring, and a cooler that was still holding ice despite the heat. Marina's vehicle was parked nearby, a late-model SUV that was clean and well-maintained, the kind of reliable transportation that responsible parents drove. There were toys visible in the back seat, a handheld video game and some action figures, the normal detritus of a child's life. Nothing about the scene suggested anything other than what Marina had described. A routine camping trip that had gone horribly wrong when a child wandered away at dusk. But there was something that bothered Elridge, a detail so small that he almost dismissed it as irrelevant, but couldn't quite ignore. The abandoned campsite he'd noticed when first arriving, the one with a tent but no vehicle, was positioned in a way that would have given its occupants a clear view of the bathroom trail that David had walked. It might mean nothing, might just be campers who'd left early or who were out hiking for the day, but the tent looked weathered in a way that suggested it had been there longer than a single weekend, and there were no camping permits displayed on the site marker that Forest Service regulations required. He walked over to the abandoned site and stood at its perimeter, not entering because he had no warrant and no probable cause, but observing what was visible from public areas. The tent was a basic dome design, faded green fabric that had been patched in several places with duct tape, the kind of budget gear that long-term campers used when they were living outdoors by necessity rather than recreation. There was a fire ring with old ashes that had been rained on and dried multiple times, suggesting the site had been occupied for weeks at minimum. Scattered around the periphery were bits of trash that should have been packed out, food wrappers and empty water bottles and cigarette butts that created a slovenly impression inconsistent with responsible camping. What caught his attention most was the complete absence of personal items that would normally be visible at an occupied campsite. No camping chairs, no cooler, no cooking gear or tarps or any of the other equipment that accumulates when people settle into a location for any length of time. The tent stood alone, and when Elridge moved to an angle where he could see through the mesh door panel, The interior appeared empty of sleeping bags or pads or any other contents. It looked abandoned, but recently, as though someone had packed up everything portable but left the tent itself behind because it wasn't worth the effort to dismantle and carry out. He radioed dispatch and requested information about any permits issued for Morrison Canyon camping, knowing that Yolanda would have to contact Forest Service records and that the response might take time. While he waited, he photographed the abandoned site from multiple angles, documenting its position relative to Marina's campsite and the bathroom facilities, creating a visual record that might prove relevant or might be completely meaningless but cost nothing to preserve. The discipline of documentation had been drilled into him during training, the understanding that you couldn't know at the time of collection what information would eventually matter. So the only safe approach was to record everything and let later analysis determine significance. Marina approached as he was finishing the photographs, asking what he'd found and whether it related to David. Elridge gave a non-committal answer, explaining that he was simply being thorough and documenting the entire camping area as part of standard procedure. He didn't mention his concerns about the abandoned site because they were still formless, instinct rather than evidence, and creating alarm before he had anything concrete would serve no purpose except to increase her anxiety. But he asked whether she'd seen anyone at that campsite during her stay, whether there had been other campers in that location when she'd arrived, or at any point during the previous day. She thought about it for a moment, her face showing the strain of trying to recall details that hadn't seemed important at the time, but might now be crucial. She said there had been a man. She'd noticed him briefly on Friday evening when they were setting up their own camp. He'd been older, maybe in his 50s, with weathered skin and the kind of lean build that came from hard living rather than gym workouts. She hadn't spoken to him directly, had just seen him moving around his campsite, and had assumed he was another camper enjoying the same area. When she'd gone to sleep Friday night, his tent was still there with a lantern visible inside. But when she'd woken Saturday morning, she hadn't paid attention to whether he was still around because she'd been focused on making breakfast and planning the day's activities with David. The description was too vague to be immediately useful. Could have matched thousands of men who camped in Arizona's backcountry for various reasons ranging from legitimate recreation to avoiding law enforcement or living off-grid by necessity. But it was something, a data point that hadn't existed before. And Elridge added it to his growing mental file of information that might or might not connect to David's disappearance. He asked whether Marina had noticed a vehicle associated with the man's campsite, but she couldn't remember seeing one, which was itself noteworthy because the camping area wasn't accessible by foot from any nearby town or trailhead. Someone camping there without a vehicle would have had to either hike in from considerable distance or been dropped off, and either scenario suggested circumstances worth investigating. The radio crackled with Yolanda's voice reporting that Forest Service records showed no current permits for Morrison Canyon, which wasn't unusual because permit enforcement in remote areas was sporadic at best, and many campers simply ignored the requirement altogether. But she'd also run a quick check of recent incident reports and found something that made Elridge's instincts sharpen with the recognition that he might be looking at something more complicated than a simple missing child case. There had been a report filed 3 weeks earlier by Greenlee County Sheriff's Office about suspected illegal activity in the Morrison Canyon area, specifically mentions of possible drug manufacturing or storage based on reports from hikers who'd noticed chemical smells and suspicious individuals telling them to leave the area. The report hadn't been followed up because county resources were stretched thin, and Morrison Canyon sat in a jurisdictional gray zone where nobody wanted to claim responsibility for enforcement. The sheriff's office had forwarded the information to the Forest Service, who'd added it to their list of areas requiring increased patrol attention, but no actual investigation had been conducted. It was the kind of bureaucratic passing of responsibility that Elridge had seen countless times, where legitimate concerns got documented and filed and never acted upon, because every agency assumed someone else would handle it. He looked back at the abandoned campsite with new understanding, seeing it not as random slovenliness but as potential evidence of exactly the kind of activity the earlier report had described. The isolated location, the long-term occupation, the absence of normal camping gear but presence of a shelter that could protect equipment or supplies from weather, all fit the pattern of what drug operations looked like in backcountry areas where detection was unlikely, and interference from authorities even less so. If someone had been using Morrison Canyon as a storage or manufacturing site, and if David had wandered into that area during his evening walk, the implications were considerably more serious than simple misadventure in wilderness. Elridge made a decision that he knew would complicate things but couldn't avoid. He called for additional resources, requesting backup from tribal police and notification to both the Greenlee County Sheriff's Office and the FBI's Indian Country Unit that handled major crimes on reservation lands. The request would trigger a multi-agency response that would take hours to coordinate and would transform the search from a local missing child case into a potential federal investigation. But the alternative was to continue operating on incomplete information while a child's life hung in the balance. The bureaucratic complications were secondary to the operational necessity of having adequate resources to search thoroughly and safely if the area was potentially compromised by criminal activity. Marina overheard enough of the radio traffic to understand that the situation was escalating beyond what she'd expected, and her expression shifted from worried to frightened as she processed the implications of federal involvement and criminal investigation terminology. Elridge pulled her aside and explained in terms that were honest but not alarmist, telling her that they were simply being thorough and that the additional resources would help conduct a more comprehensive search, but that she should prepare for the possibility that David's disappearance might not be a simple case of getting lost. He didn't elaborate on what he suspected, because doing so before having any evidence would be irresponsible, but he wanted her to understand that the investigation was entering a new phase where cooperation and honesty would be crucial. She asked directly whether he thought someone had taken David, whether this was a kidnapping rather than an accident, and Elridge gave the only answer he could under the circumstances. He said he didn't know yet, that they were looking at all possibilities and following every lead, and that the most important thing was to find David as quickly as possible regardless of what had caused his disappearance. It was the standard law enforcement non-answer that revealed nothing while sounding reassuring, and he could see in Marina's eyes that she understood exactly what he wasn't saying. The sun had moved across the sky while they talked, and the afternoon heat had intensified to the point where exertion became dangerous without constant hydration. Elridge returned to his patrol truck and pulled out the search and rescue equipment that he kept stored for exactly these situations: water bottles and first aid supplies and emergency blankets that would be needed if David was found suffering from exposure. He also retrieved his sidearm from the locked compartment where he kept it during routine patrol, securing it in his duty holster with the conscious awareness that the gesture transformed his posture from helpful responder to prepared law enforcement. Other campers had been watching the activity from their sites, and several approached asking what was happening and whether they could help. Elridge took their names and contact information, documenting who had been present during the relevant time period and gathering preliminary statements about what they'd seen or heard. Most had nothing useful to offer, had been focused on their own activities and hadn't noticed anything unusual until Marina began searching for David. But one couple, retirees from Phoenix who'd been camping in the area for several days, mentioned that they'd heard vehicle traffic on the access road late Friday night. Unusual because most campers settled in by dark, and there was no reason for through traffic in an area that dead-ended at the camping facilities. They couldn't describe the vehicle beyond saying it had sounded like a truck rather than a car, and they hadn't seen it because they'd been inside their trailer with the windows closed against the cooling night air. The timing was vague, sometime between 10 and midnight. which would have been hours after David disappeared, but could still be relevant if someone had been moving equipment or supplies under cover of darkness. Elridge added the information to his notes and asked the couple to remain available for further questions, knowing that their statement might become more significant once he understood more about what had been happening in Morrison Canyon. The first backup arrived just before 4 o'clock in the form of 2 tribal officers from the Fort Apache district, who'd driven down after receiving the assistance request. They were younger than Elridge, both relatively new to the force but trained in search and rescue procedures and eager to help in any way they could. He briefed them on the situation, showing them the area that had already been searched and outlining his concerns about the abandoned campsite and the possible connection to criminal activity. They listened with the focused attention of officers who understood they were walking into something potentially complex and dangerous, and when he finished, they began preparing for a systematic search of the areas beyond what the civilian search parties had already covered. Elridge assigned them sectors radiating out from the bathroom facilities, giving them radios and clear instructions to maintain contact and report anything unusual regardless of whether it seemed directly related to finding David. The desert was unforgiving in its heat, and he stressed the importance of hydration and rest breaks, not wanting to create additional casualties by pushing searchers beyond their physical limits. They set out in opposite directions, moving with the methodical pace that proper searching required, scanning the ground for tracks or disturbed vegetation while also watching the horizon for any movement or anomaly that might indicate David's location. Alone again, except for Marina, who'd retreated to her campsite to wait and presumably to pray, or hope, or engage in whatever mental activity helped her cope with the unbearable waiting, Elridge returned to the abandoned campsite and stood at its edge, considering his options. He had no warrant and technically no jurisdiction since the land was Forest Service rather than tribal. But he had reasonable suspicion that the site might contain evidence relevant to a missing child investigation, and emergency circumstances created exigencies that courts generally recognized as justifying searches that would otherwise require warrants. The calculation was straightforward from an operational standpoint. The potential benefit of finding evidence that could lead to David far outweighed the risk of evidence being excluded from prosecution if his search was later deemed improper. He entered the campsite perimeter and approached the tent with careful steps that avoided disturbing the ground more than necessary, conscious that he was potentially contaminating a crime scene but accepting that necessity sometimes required compromise. The tent's zipper was partially open, the mesh door panel accessible, and he used a pen from his pocket to pull it wider without leaving fingerprints on the fabric. The interior was empty, as he'd observed from distance, but standing at the threshold and looking down into the enclosed space, he noticed something that hadn't been visible from farther away. There were stains on the tent floor, dark patches that could have been spilled food or dirt or any number of innocent substances, but had a distribution pattern that suggested liquid had pooled and been absorbed by the fabric rather than tracked in from outside. The stains were concentrated near the tent's rear section, and they had the brownish color that biological fluids took on after exposure to heat and time. Elridge photographed them with his phone, documenting their size and location and the way they seemed to radiate from a central point, then backed out of the tent without entering fully or disturbing anything that might need to be processed by forensic teams. The sun was lower now, painting the canyon walls with orange and red light that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, but now just served as a reminder that another night was approaching, and David had already been missing for one complete cycle of darkness. Elridge radioed the 2 officers conducting the sector search and requested status updates, receiving reports that they'd covered their assigned areas without finding any sign of David or encountering anything unusual. He instructed them to return to the camping area and prepare for the arrival of additional resources, knowing that darkness would soon make searching impossible and that they'd need to establish a base of operations for what was likely to become an extended investigation. Marina appeared from her campsite as the officers were returning, her face showing the strain of hours spent in limbo between hope and despair. She asked whether they'd found anything, and Elridge had to give the answer she didn't want to hear, that the search was continuing but so far without results. He tried to soften it by explaining that the additional resources arriving would allow them to expand the search area significantly, that specialized teams with tracking dogs and thermal imaging equipment were being mobilized, but he could see that each word of explanation was just another confirmation that her son was still missing, and that the chances of finding him alive were diminishing with each passing hour. The federal agent arrived as twilight was settling over the canyon. A single vehicle carrying Denton Halbrook from the FBI's Tucson field office. He was a man in his early 40s with the kind of neutral professional appearance that federal agents cultivated, neither memorable nor threatening, dressed in field clothes that were appropriate for the terrain, but clearly not his usual work attire. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and immediately asked for a briefing on everything that had been discovered so far, listening without interrupting while Elridge walked him through the timeline and the concerns about the abandoned campsite and the possible connection to the earlier reports of illegal activity in the area. Denton's expression remained carefully neutral throughout the briefing, but when Elridge mentioned the stains in the tent, something shifted in his eyes that suggested he was now thinking about this as potentially much more serious than a missing child case. He asked to see the site, and together they walked to the abandoned camp while the last light faded and the first stars began appearing in a sky that was darkening from blue to purple to black. The tent was barely visible in the dimness, and Denton used a flashlight to illuminate the interior, spending several minutes examining the stains that Elridge had photographed earlier. When he straightened up and turned off the flashlight, his face was set in an expression that Elridge had seen before on investigators who'd just recognized that a case was going to consume weeks or months of their lives. Denton said quietly that they needed to secure the site immediately and call for a full forensic response, that the stains were consistent with blood, and that the amount and pattern suggested something violent had occurred in that tent. He didn't say what he was thinking about David's chances, didn't need to, because both of them understood that if the tent was a crime scene, and if David had encountered whoever had been using it, the probability of finding him alive had just dropped significantly. The forensic team arrived from Phoenix just after midnight, their convoy of vehicles navigating the rough access roads with the cautious speed of people who understood that destroying evidence through careless approach would be worse than delaying their arrival by a few extra minutes. Elridge had spent the intervening hours establishing a perimeter around the abandoned campsite, using crime scene tape and portable barriers to mark the area as off-limits, while maintaining a log of everyone who'd been near the site before its significance had been recognized. The documentation was tedious work, but crucial for maintaining chain of custody and ensuring that any evidence collected could withstand the scrutiny of defense attorneys who would attack every procedural gap they could identify. Denton had spent the same hours on his phone and laptop, coordinating with his field office and pulling records that might connect the Morrison Canyon area to known criminal operations. The cell signal was weak and intermittent, forcing him to repeat information multiple times and occasionally drive to higher ground, where the connection improved marginally. But by the time the forensic team began setting up their equipment, he'd assembled a preliminary picture that made Elridge's initial instincts look increasingly justified. There had been 3 separate reports over the past 6 months about suspicious activity in canyons along the reservation's eastern boundary, all describing similar patterns of hostile individuals, ordering hikers to leave areas that should have been open to public access, and chemical smells that suggested manufacturing operations rather than legitimate camping. None of the reports had been investigated thoroughly because they fell into jurisdictional gaps where tribal police lacked resources, county sheriffs claimed the areas were federal responsibility, and Forest Service rangers were spread too thin to follow up on every complaint. The result was a patchwork of documented concerns that had never been connected or analyzed as potentially related components of a larger operation. Denton explained this to Elridge while they watched the forensic technicians begin processing the tent, his tone carrying the frustration of someone who'd seen too many cases where bureaucratic fragmentation allowed criminal activity to flourish in the spaces between agencies that should have been coordinating but weren't. The lead forensic technician was a woman named Portis, who'd spent 20 years processing crime scenes across Arizona and had the kind of methodical efficiency that came from doing difficult work so many times that it became routine. She directed her team with minimal verbal communication, using hand signals and established protocols to ensure that every surface and substance was documented before being collected, that photographs captured multiple angles and scales, and that nothing was disturbed until its position and condition had been recorded in ways that would allow later reconstruction of the scene. Elridge watched from outside the perimeter, learning from her technique while also scanning the surrounding darkness for any movement that might indicate someone was observing the investigation. The initial assessment of the tent's interior took nearly 2 hours, with technicians using chemical reagents to test the stains and UV lights to reveal traces that weren't visible to normal observation. The results confirmed what both Elridge and Denton had suspected. The stains were blood, human blood based on preliminary field testing, and the quantity suggested either a serious injury or something worse. The distribution pattern indicated the source had been relatively stationary, pooling in one location rather than tracking across the tent floor, which could mean the bleeding had occurred while someone was lying down or restrained. There were also traces of what appeared to be cleaning attempts, areas where the fabric showed chemical residue consistent with bleach or similar disinfectants, suggesting whoever had occupied the tent had tried to remove evidence after whatever had happened there. Portis emerged from the tent just before 2 a.m. and pulled off her protective gloves with the careful deliberation of someone transitioning from technical work to human interaction. She briefed Elridge and Denton in the flat professional tone that forensic specialists used when discussing horrors that would give normal people nightmares, explaining that beyond the blood evidence, they'd found hair samples and fiber evidence that would need laboratory analysis to determine origin and relevance. There were also footprint impressions and dust that had accumulated on the tent floor. Multiple, distinct patterns suggesting at least 3 different individuals had been inside the tent at various times. Though without controlled comparison samples, it would be impossible to determine when each person had been present or whether any of the prints belonged to David. The discovery that troubled her most, and the one she mentioned with visible reluctance, was a small section of tent fabric near the rear wall that had been cut from the inside, the edges showing the deliberate scoring pattern that came from someone using a blade to create an opening. The cut was low to the ground and measured roughly 8 inches in length, large enough for a child to squeeze through but too small for most adults. The fabric around the cut showed no blood traces, suggesting it had been made either before the bleeding event or after the tent had been cleaned, and its purpose wasn't immediately clear. It could have been an escape route, or a ventilation modification or something else entirely, but its existence suggested planning and intentionality rather than random violence. Elridge asked whether there was any way to determine if David had been in the tent, whether the evidence collected could confirm or rule out his presence, and Portis gave the answer he'd expected but hoped against. Without comparison samples from David, clothing, or personal items that could provide DNA or fiber evidence, they couldn't make definitive connections between the scene and the missing child. If Marina could provide something, a hairbrush or worn clothing that hadn't been washed, the laboratory could potentially identify matches. But even then, the results would take days or weeks to process through backlogs and protocols that couldn't be rushed regardless of how urgent the circumstances felt to those waiting for answers. Marina was asleep in her vehicle when Elridge approached just after 3 a.m. Her body curled in the driver's seat in a position that looked desperately uncomfortable, but was probably the only rest she'd managed in the past 2 days. He hated to wake her, but needed items that could provide the comparison samples Portis had requested, and waiting until morning would mean additional delays in processing that they couldn't afford. She stirred when he tapped gently on the window, her eyes opening with the instant alertness of someone who'd been sleeping lightly, if at all, hoping for news that would end the nightmare, but fearing what that news might be. He explained what he needed and why, keeping his language clinical and avoiding details about the blood evidence that would only intensify her distress without providing actionable information. She climbed out of the vehicle, moving with the stiff awkwardness of someone who'd been stationary too long in an uncomfortable position, and began searching through the camping gear for items that would serve the forensic team's needs. She found David's sleeping bag, still in the tent where he'd left it before walking to the bathroom facilities that final evening, and she pulled from it a t-shirt he'd worn the previous day and a small stuffed animal that he'd slept with since he was a toddler, despite being nominally too old for such things. Her hands shook as she passed the items to Elridge, and when she spoke, her voice had the hollow quality of someone who'd crossed some threshold of emotional endurance and was now operating on autopilot because breaking down completely wasn't an option, while there was still hope, however fragile, that her son might be found alive. She asked whether the evidence meant they thought David was dead, whether the blood in the tent meant they were no longer searching for a living child, but recovering a body, and Elridge gave the most honest answer he could manage, given the uncertainties and the need to maintain some measure of hope for her sanity. He said they didn't know yet what had happened, that blood evidence could indicate many things from minor injury to serious violence, and that until they found David or developed more information, the investigation would proceed on the assumption that he was alive and needed to be located as quickly as possible. It was technically true, even if it avoided acknowledging the statistical realities that both of them understood. The children who disappeared under suspicious circumstances and remained missing for more than 24 hours were far more likely to be found dead than alive, and that evidence of violence at a nearby location significantly worsened those already grim odds. The eastern sky was showing the first pale hints of approaching dawn when the search teams began assembling for the day's operations. The FBI had brought in a tracking dog unit from their Phoenix office, German shepherds trained in search and rescue operations, and handled by specialists who'd worked dozens of similar cases across the Southwest. The dogs were impressive animals, focused and disciplined in ways that reflected the intensive training they'd received, and their handlers explained the methodology they'd used to search the areas radiating out from the camping facility. They'd start with David's scent articles, the clothing and sleeping bag that Marina had provided, allowing the dogs to establish baseline recognition before beginning systematic sweeps of terrain that human searchers might have covered, but couldn't process with the same olfactory precision that trained animals brought to the work. Elridge joined one of the search teams, partnering with a younger tribal officer who'd arrived with the morning shift and who had grown up in the area with knowledge of the canyon systems and water sources that might not appear on official maps. They moved east from the camping area, following drainage patterns and game trails while the dog team worked a parallel track 50 yards to their north. The morning air was still relatively cool, the temperature in the low 80s, but climbing steadily as the sun cleared the horizon and began its daily assault on anything exposed to its direct radiation. They carried water and emergency supplies, prepared for the possibility of finding David alive but incapacitated, while also understanding that each hour without discovery made that scenario less likely. The terrain was unforgiving, a landscape of rocky outcrops and arroyos carved by flash floods that could transform dry washes into raging torrents within minutes when monsoon rains hit the higher elevations. Vegetation was sparse, mostly creosote and mesquite, with occasional palo verde trees marking places where underground water came close enough to the surface to support larger plant life. The ground showed animal tracks, deer and javelina, and smaller creatures, but no obvious human prints despite the search team's careful observation of every surface that might hold impressions. The absence of tracks wasn't necessarily meaningful in terrain this hard and rocky, but it was discouraging to spend hours searching without finding any trace of the child they were desperately trying to locate. Around mid-morning, the dog team signaled a discovery that brought all nearby searchers converging on their position with the combination of hope and dread that characterized every potential breakthrough in missing person cases. What they'd found wasn't David, but evidence that someone had been in the area recently. A discarded water bottle lying in the shade of a rock overhang about half a mile east of the camping area. The bottle was plastic, generic brand, with perhaps 2 inches of water still sloshing in the bottom and condensation on the interior surface suggesting it hadn't been exposed to full sun for an extended period. There were no labels or identifying marks, nothing that would indicate who'd drunk from it or when they'd been in this location, but its presence was anomalous enough to warrant documentation and collection as potential evidence. The dog handlers allowed their animals to investigate the bottle and the surrounding area, watching for behavioral changes that would indicate whether the scent matched David or was something unrelated. One of the dogs showed interest, circling the area and focusing on a route that led further east into rougher terrain. But the handler cautioned that the interest could mean many things, and didn't necessarily confirm that David had been at this location. Scent could travel on air currents, and could be deposited by contact with contaminated surfaces, creating false trails that wasted search resources if followed without corroborating evidence. The decision was made to mark the location and continue the systematic search pattern, rather than committing resources to following a single potentially misleading indicator. Elridge photographed the water bottle and its position, then used an evidence bag to collect it for later laboratory analysis that might reveal fingerprints or DNA that could connect it to David or to other individuals of interest. The find was logged with GPS coordinates and timestamps, adding another data point to the growing collection of information that would eventually need to be analyzed and synthesized into some coherent understanding of what had happened at Morrison Canyon. He felt the familiar frustration of investigation work, the way evidence accumulated slowly and often ambiguously, refusing to arrange itself into clear narratives despite the human need for stories that made sense and provided closure. By noon, the temperature had climbed above 100 degrees, and the search teams were rotating through mandatory rest breaks, sheltering in shade and consuming water and electrolyte supplements while their body temperatures stabilized enough to resume exertion. Elridge used one of these breaks to check in with Denton, who'd remained at the camping area coordinating the overall investigation and managing the flow of information between various agencies that had converged on Morrison Canyon. The federal agent looked exhausted despite not having participated in the physical searching, his fatigue coming from the mental strain of trying to maintain control over an operation that involved multiple jurisdictions and competing priorities and personalities that didn't always work well together. Denton had news that complicated the investigation in ways that Elridge immediately recognized as significant. Background checks on the Morrison Canyon area had revealed that one of the parcels of land adjacent to the Forest Service boundary was privately owned, purchased 3 years earlier through a shell company registered in Nevada, with ownership documentation that led to dead ends and corporations that existed only on paper. The property was accessed by an unmarked dirt road that branched off from the main canyon access route about 2 miles before the camping area, and aerial imagery showed what appeared to be a small structure and vehicle tracks suggesting regular use despite the remote location and absence of any legitimate residential or commercial purpose that would explain the investment. The discovery triggered immediate concern that they were looking at a more sophisticated operation than initially suspected, something beyond simple drug manufacturing or storage, and potentially connected to organized criminal networks with resources to establish infrastructure and maintain operational security. Denton had requested additional federal resources, including a tactical team that could approach the private property safely if probable cause developed to justify entry. But he'd also cautioned that without direct evidence connecting the property to David's disappearance, Obtaining warrants would be difficult, and any premature action might jeopardize eventual prosecution if the property occupants were involved in criminal activity, but not specifically in the missing child case. The legal and tactical complications were giving him headaches, both figurative and literal based on the way he kept rubbing his temples, and Elridge could see the weight of command decisions settling on him as he tried to balance the urgency of finding David against the requirements of proper procedure and the political realities of multi-agency operations, where missteps would be analyzed and criticized by supervisors who had the luxury of hindsight and no responsibility for making real-time choices under pressure and incomplete information. Elridge asked whether aerial reconnaissance had been conducted over the private property, whether they had current imagery showing activity or vehicles, or anything that might indicate occupation. And Denton explained that he'd requested drone surveillance, but been told that authorization would take hours because of airspace restrictions and tribal sovereignty issues that complicated what would normally be straightforward federal operations. The reservation boundary ran close to the private property in ways that made it unclear whether surveillance would violate tribal jurisdiction, and nobody wanted to create diplomatic incidents by conducting operations that could be interpreted as federal overreach into tribal authority without proper notification and coordination. The bureaucratic obstacles were infuriating when measured against a child's life hanging in the balance, but both men understood that cutting corners might feel satisfying in the moment, but would have consequences that extended beyond this single case. If they violated procedure and contaminated evidence or triggered legal challenges that resulted in suppression of crucial information, they could destroy any chance of prosecution and ensure that whoever was responsible for David's disappearance would escape justice through the very legal system that was supposed to hold them accountable. The tension between urgency and procedure was a constant feature of law enforcement work, and learning to navigate it without becoming either reckless or paralyzed was a skill that took years to develop and never became comfortable. The afternoon search operations expanded to cover terrain further from the camping area, with teams pushing into regions that were increasingly remote and difficult to navigate. Elridge's team encountered several areas where vegetation had been disturbed recently, branches broken and ground scuffed in ways that could indicate human passage, or could simply be the result of animal movement or natural erosion. Each potential sign required careful evaluation, photographs and documentation, and decisions about whether to commit resources to following trails that might lead nowhere, or might be the crucial break that the investigation desperately needed. Around 3 o'clock, one of the search teams radioed that they'd found something significant, and the tone in the officer's voice made Elridge's stomach clench with the recognition that this wasn't going to be good news. He and his partner moved toward the reported coordinates as quickly as the terrain allowed, scrambling over rock formations and through dense brush that tore at their clothing and skin. When they reached the location, marked by other searchers who'd converged from different directions, what they found confirmed everyone's worst fears, while also opening new questions about what had happened to David. The discovery was clothing, a child's t-shirt that matched the description of what David had been wearing when he disappeared. It was lying in a small depression at the base of a rock outcrop, partially concealed by fallen branches in a way that could have been deliberate hiding or could have been natural accumulation. The fabric showed tears and stains, dark patches that could have been blood or dirt or any number of substances, and there was damage to the shoulder seam that suggested the shirt had been removed forcibly rather than taken off normally. The condition and location raised immediate questions about why it would be here, more than a mile from the camping area and well off any established trails that David would have had reason to follow. Portis and her forensic team were called to the location, picking their way through the rough terrain with equipment cases that must have weighed 40 pounds each, but which they carried without complaint because proper evidence collection couldn't be compromised by convenience or comfort. She examined the shirt in place before collecting it, photographing its position and condition from multiple angles while explaining to the assembled officers what she was seeing and what it might indicate. The tears appeared consistent with snagging on vegetation or rocks during movement through brush, suggesting the shirt had been worn while someone traveled through difficult terrain rather than being removed and then damaged afterward. The stains would require laboratory analysis to determine their composition, but their distribution and color suggested multiple substances rather than a single source of contamination. What troubled her most was the shoulder seam damage, which showed characteristics consistent with forcible removal while the wearer was struggling or resisting. The stitching had been torn rather than simply coming loose from wear, and the fabric around the tear showed stress marks that indicated pulling force had been applied. It wasn't conclusive evidence of abduction or violence. Children's clothing failed in all sorts of ways during normal play and adventure, but combined with the other evidence accumulating around the investigation, it added weight to the theory that David hadn't simply wandered off and gotten lost, but had encountered someone or something that had taken him away from the camping area against his will. The search radius was immediately expanded to cover the area surrounding the shirt discovery, with teams forming concentric rings and moving outward while maintaining visual contact and radio communication. The terrain became progressively more difficult as they moved further from established trails, requiring scrambling and climbing that would have been challenging for adults with proper equipment, and would have been nearly impossible for an 8-year-old child in running shoes and casual clothing. The implications were disturbing, suggesting either that David had been extraordinarily determined or desperate to travel this far into wilderness, or, more likely, that he hadn't come here under his own power but had been transported by someone who knew the area and had reasons for bringing him to such a remote location. Elridge found himself thinking about the timeline, trying to reconstruct what could have happened in the hours between David's disappearance from the camping area and the present moment. If someone had taken him, they would have needed to move him quickly enough to avoid detection by the search parties that had begun looking for him within hours of his disappearance, but carefully enough to avoid leaving obvious trails that would lead searchers directly to their location. The private property that Denton had mentioned became increasingly significant in this mental reconstruction, a possible destination where someone could hide a child away from search operations while maintaining access to vehicles and supplies and whatever infrastructure supported their operation. The thought of David being held somewhere nearby, possibly within miles of where dozens of officers were searching, was almost unbearable. Elridge pushed the emotional response aside and focused on the tactical implications, considering how someone holding a captive child would behave and what mistakes they might make that could provide opportunities for rescue. If the property was occupied, there would be routines and patterns, times when vigilance dropped and vulnerabilities opened. The challenge was identifying those patterns before time ran out for David, before whoever held him decided he was too much of a liability to keep alive or simply lost interest in whatever purpose he'd been taken for. Denton called with an update just before sunset, his voice tight with controlled excitement about a development that might provide the breakthrough they needed. The Nevada shell company that owned the private property adjacent to Morrison Canyon had been linked through financial records to other properties across Arizona and New Mexico, forming a network that suggested coordinated criminal enterprise rather than isolated illegal activity. More significantly, one of the associated properties had been raided 6 months earlier by DEA agents who had discovered a methamphetamine production facility and arrested 2 individuals whose records showed connections to trafficking organizations operating across the Southwest. The connection wasn't definitive proof that the Morrison Canyon property was part of the same operation, but it established probable cause for obtaining warrants and justified federal action that would have been legally questionable based solely on the missing child case. Denton was coordinating with his supervisors to assemble a tactical team that could approach the property safely, conduct surveillance, and execute entry if warranted by what they observed. The operation was being scheduled for the following morning, when visibility would be adequate for safe approach, but early enough that occupants might still be present, rather than having dispersed to avoid daytime heat. Elridge requested and received permission to accompany the tactical team, understanding that his knowledge of the local terrain and tribal jurisdiction issues could prove valuable during operations that would inevitably involve complications beyond what federal agents trained in urban environments would anticipate. He spent the evening preparing equipment and reviewing maps, familiarizing himself with approach routes and escape paths, and all the tactical considerations that would determine whether the operation succeeded in rescuing David or failed in ways that might cost the child his life if things went wrong at critical moments. Marina was informed that developments had occurred, but not given details about the tactical planning or the property that had been identified as a target of interest. The decision to withhold information was made to protect operational security and to avoid giving her false hope that might be crushed if the raid found nothing related to her son. But Elridge felt the weight of that decision as he watched her sitting alone in her vehicle. She deserved to know everything they knew and to be part of every decision that affected her child's fate. But operational necessity sometimes required excluding the very people who had the most at stake in outcomes that would determine whether they ever saw their loved ones alive again. The night passed slowly, with Elridge managing perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep in his patrol truck before the pre-dawn briefing that would launch the tactical operation. The assembled team included FBI agents from the Phoenix field office, DEA personnel who'd worked the previous raid on the connected property, and tribal officers including Elridge, who would provide local knowledge and jurisdictional authority if the operation crossed onto reservation land. They reviewed aerial imagery and discussed approach routes and established communication protocols, and ran through contingencies for various scenarios ranging from the property being abandoned to active resistance from armed occupants who might use David as a hostage if they realized law enforcement was closing in. The plan called for a two-phase approach: initial surveillance from concealed positions to determine current occupation and activity levels, followed by tactical entry if probable cause developed, or if immediate action became necessary to prevent harm to David or destruction of evidence. The team would deploy in darkness to reach observation positions before sunrise, using night vision equipment to monitor the property while maintaining radio silence except for emergency communications. If David was seen or heard, if there was any indication he was being held at the location, the timeline would accelerate, and entry would be executed immediately regardless of other tactical considerations. The approach to the private property began at 4:30 in the morning, with the tactical team moving through darkness so complete that without night vision equipment, navigation would have been impossible. Elridge was positioned in the middle of the column, his role designated as liaison and terrain advisor rather than primary tactical operator. But he carried the same weapons and protective gear as the federal agents surrounding him because things could deteriorate rapidly in operations like this, and being unprepared when violence erupted was a mistake that people rarely survived to regret. The night air was cool, probably in the low 70s, a brief respite from the daytime heat that would return with savage intensity once the sun cleared the eastern ridges and began its daily work of turning the desert into something hostile to human life. They moved in near silence, communicating through hand signals and the occasional whispered radio transmission when coordination required more precision than gestures could provide. The terrain was treacherous in darkness, loose rock and hidden depressions that could turn an ankle, or send someone tumbling down slopes that were steep enough to cause serious injury. Elridge used his knowledge of the area to guide the team along routes that minimized exposure and noise, following drainage patterns and natural corridors that provided concealment while allowing relatively efficient movement toward the target property. The distance was approximately 2 miles from where they'd staged the vehicles, a calculation based on getting close enough for effective surveillance while remaining far enough away that engine noise or other sounds wouldn't alert anyone at the property to law enforcement presence. The property's perimeter was marked by a barbed wire fence that was newer than the surrounding terrain suggested it should be. The posts still straight and the wire showing minimal rust, despite the corrosive effects of desert weather on metal. The fence wasn't a serious obstacle to trained personnel, but its presence indicated someone had invested in establishing boundaries and probably had reasons beyond simple property demarcation for wanting to control access. Elridge noted the fence's condition and construction quality, recognizing it as the kind of installation that professionals did when they were serious about security, rather than the casual barriers that casual landowners erected to satisfy legal requirements without really caring whether they were effective. The team established observation positions on a ridgeline that provided sight lines to the property's main structures while offering concealment behind rock formations and vegetation. Through night vision optics, the layout became visible as a collection of buildings arranged in a compound pattern rather than the random distribution that characterized legitimate rural homesteads. There was a main structure, probably living quarters based on its size, and the presence of what appeared to be windows and a door facing away from the observation position. Adjacent to it was a larger building with metal walls that reflected the faint starlight in ways that suggested industrial construction, possibly a warehouse or workshop. 2 vehicles were parked near the main building, pickup trucks that looked relatively new and well-maintained, and there were several smaller outbuildings that could have been storage sheds or equipment shelters. What made Elridge's pulse quicken was the presence of lights, not illumination spilling from windows that would indicate normal occupation, but security lighting on motion sensors that periodically flicked on and off as small animals or wind-blown debris triggered them. The lighting system was more sophisticated than what you'd expect for a simple rural property, suggesting the occupants were concerned about perimeter security in ways that implied they had valuable assets to protect or illegal activities to conceal. Combined with the new fence and the industrial building and the remote location that made casual observation unlikely, the property had all the characteristics of a drug operation or similar criminal enterprise that required isolation and infrastructure beyond what legitimate activities would justify. Denton was positioned next to Elridge, both men prone behind a rock formation that provided cover while allowing them to observe the property through optics and relay information to the rest of the team. They watched in silence for nearly an hour, documenting patterns of activity and structural details that would inform tactical planning when the decision was made to move from surveillance to direct action. During that time, they saw no human movement, no indication that the property was currently occupied beyond the passive security measures and the presence of vehicles that could have been parked there for days or weeks without necessarily meaning anyone was present. Around 5:30, just as the eastern sky was beginning to show the first pale suggestions of approaching dawn, movement appeared at the main building. A door opened, spilling artificial light across the compound yard for perhaps 5 seconds before closing again, and a figure emerged and walked toward one of the outbuildings with the purposeful gait of someone conducting routine morning tasks rather than responding to any emergency. Through the night vision optics, the figure appeared as a green-tinged silhouette, details obscured by the technology's limitations and the remaining darkness, but clearly an adult male based on size and movement patterns. He disappeared into the outbuilding and emerged perhaps 2 minutes later, carrying something that looked like a container or box, returned to the main building, and vanished inside when the door opened and closed again with the same brief spill of interior lighting. The observation was significant because it confirmed the property was occupied, and that occupants were active during hours when legitimate rural residents might be present, but wouldn't necessarily be conducting tasks that required moving supplies between buildings. Denton immediately radioed the information to the tactical team leader, a FBI special agent named Torino, who was positioned with the entry team at a different location closer to the property's access road. They exchanged brief communications about timing and approach methods, weighing the tactical advantages of striking now while it was still dark against waiting for better visibility that would come with dawn, but might also give occupants more warning of the approaching team. The decision was made to initiate entry immediately, before full daylight and before additional occupants potentially arrived or departed. The logic was sound from a tactical perspective. Darkness favored the team that had night vision equipment and training in low-light operations, and delay created opportunities for situations to change in ways that might complicate or prevent safe execution of the raid. Elridge felt his adrenaline surge as the decision was communicated, and the team began moving from observation positions toward assault staging areas. The transition from passive watching to active engagement triggering physiological responses that training could manage but never eliminate. The entry team approached the main building from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated movement designed to minimize reaction time for anyone inside and prevent escape or destruction of evidence. Elridge remained with Denton at the observation position. Their role now shifted to overwatch and support rather than direct participation in the building breach. Through their optics, they watched as figures in tactical gear materialized from the darkness and took positions at doors and windows, moving with the practiced precision of teams that had executed similar operations dozens or hundreds of times. There was a moment of stillness, perhaps 10 seconds where everyone was in position, but nothing was happening. The calm before violence that Elridge had experienced before, and recognized as the point where training and planning either succeeded or failed, based on factors that were often beyond anyone's control. The breach was announced with the explosive sound of a battering ram striking the main building's door, followed immediately by flashbang grenades that detonated inside with concussive force designed to disorient and temporarily incapacitate anyone in the structure. The noise echoed across the desert landscape, sharp reports that would be audible for miles in the pre-dawn stillness, and then the entry team was flowing through the opened door, shouting commands that were procedure and law and warning all compressed into words that had to be delivered, even though compliance was rarely immediate when people were startled from sleep or surprised during illegal activity. Elridge listened to the radio traffic as the team cleared rooms, the clipped professional language of operators reporting what they found and requesting backup or specialized resources as situations developed. The main building had 3 occupants, all adult males who were taken into custody without resistance after the initial shock of the entry wore off, and they realized that fighting would be suicide against a team that had every tactical advantage. The individuals were secured and separated for questioning, the standard procedure to prevent them from coordinating stories or communicating information that might compromise the investigation. But there was no sign of David in the main building, no indication that a child was present or had been present recently. The entry team moved to the secondary structures, clearing them with the same methodical care while Elridge and Denton watched from their overwatch position and felt the first stirrings of doubt about whether their intelligence had led them to the right location. The industrial building yielded evidence of drug manufacturing, laboratory equipment, and chemical supplies consistent with methamphetamine production, confirming that the property was indeed being used for criminal purposes and justifying the raid from a narcotics enforcement perspective. But drug operations weren't why they were here, and finding evidence of crimes that weren't directly related to David's disappearance felt like a failure, even though it represented success by other metrics. The outbuildings were searched next, smaller structures that took less time to clear but were equally empty of any trace of the missing child. Elridge felt frustration building as each negative report came through the radio, the growing realization that despite the careful planning and the tactical precision and the reasonable suspicion that had justified the operation, they might have gotten it wrong. David might not be here, might never have been here, and every minute spent searching this property was time that could have been used searching elsewhere for a child whose location remained unknown and whose chances of survival decreased with each passing hour. Denton's expression was unreadable behind his night vision equipment, but when he spoke, his voice carried the same frustration that Elridge was feeling. He said they'd check everything, tear apart every structure and search every inch of the property before accepting that David wasn't here. Because the alternative was admitting they'd committed significant resources to a raid that would produce drug arrests, but wouldn't bring them any closer to finding the missing child who was the actual priority, regardless of what the case statistics would eventually show. The detained individuals were questioned separately, each handled by experienced agents who knew how to exploit the psychology of custody and the fears that people harbored about being charged as accessories to crimes more serious than whatever they'd personally committed. The interrogations revealed that the property had been operating as a methamphetamine lab for approximately 8 months, that the 3 occupants were low-level operators working for an organization that provided supplies and collected product, but maintained separation between different tiers of the operation to insulate leadership from prosecution if production sites were discovered. None of them claimed knowledge of any child being brought to the property, and their reactions when asked about David seemed genuinely confused rather than rehearsed denials designed to conceal involvement. But one detail emerged during questioning that redirected the investigation in ways that Elridge immediately recognized as significant. The main occupant, a man in his 40s who identified himself as the property's caretaker and primary cook for the drug operation, mentioned that they'd had problems with a squatter who'd been camping in Morrison Canyon and who'd been warned multiple times to stay away from the area because his presence was attracting attention from hikers who might report suspicious activity to authorities. The squatter had been described as older, probably in his 50s, and had been living rough in the canyon for at least several weeks before the warnings convinced him to relocate to somewhere less problematic for the drug operation. The description matched what Marina had said about the man she'd seen at the abandoned campsite. The weathered individual who'd been present Friday evening, but whose tent had apparently been vacated by Saturday morning. Elridge asked whether the caretaker knew where the squatter had gone after leaving Morrison Canyon, whether there had been any subsequent contact or indication of where he might have relocated. And the answer opened new investigative paths that were both promising and deeply troubling. The squatter had apparently mentioned during one of their confrontations that he had friends in the area, people who'd let him stay on their property when camping on public land became too risky or uncomfortable. The caretaker didn't know specifics, hadn't cared enough to press for details because his only concern was getting the squatter away from the canyon, but the implication was clear that there were other locations in the region where someone could disappear with assistance from individuals who didn't ask questions or report things to authorities. Denton immediately redirected investigative resources toward identifying properties in the surrounding area that might fit the profile of places where a squatter could find refuge. It was frustratingly vague guidance. The region contained hundreds of remote properties and informal camps where people lived outside normal society's boundaries. But it was more than they'd had before the raid, and represented a concrete lead that could be pursued through records, searches, and local knowledge. Elridge contributed what he knew about off-grid settlements and illegal camps on reservation boundary areas. Places where tribal police had limited jurisdiction and county sheriffs rarely ventured because the effort required to address quality-of-life violations didn't justify the resources when more serious crimes demanded attention. The sun had risen fully by the time the property search was completed, and the detained individuals were being transported to federal custody for formal processing and charging. The raid had been successful in disrupting a drug operation, and would probably lead to additional arrests as investigators traced the supply chain and distribution network, but it had failed in its primary objective of finding David or developing immediate leads to his location. Elridge felt the weight of that failure as he and Denton drove back toward Morrison Canyon, knowing that Marina would be waiting for news and that telling her they'd found nothing directly related to her son would be devastating, regardless of how the information was presented. The forensic team was still processing the abandoned campsite when they arrived, working through evidence that had accumulated during the night and early morning. Portis had news that complicated the investigation's emotional landscape in ways that made Elridge's chest tighten with the recognition that they were dealing with something worse than he'd initially feared. The blood evidence from the tent had been analyzed through rapid processing protocols, and while definitive DNA results would take longer, preliminary testing indicated the blood came from at least 2 different individuals. One sample was consistent with an adult male based on quantity and distribution patterns, while a smaller amount appeared to come from a different source that could potentially be a child based on the limited volume and location within the tent. The implications were clear and terrible. Violence had occurred in that tent, probably involving multiple people, and while they couldn't yet confirm whether one of those people was David, the circumstantial evidence was pointing increasingly toward the conclusion that he'd somehow encountered the tent's occupant, and that the encounter had turned violent. Whether David had been injured in whatever happened, whether he was still alive somewhere recovering, or being held, or had succumbed to injuries sustained in the tent, remained unknown. But the possibilities were narrowing toward outcomes that no one wanted to contemplate. Marina was informed of the developments in language that tried to balance honesty with sensitivity to her emotional state, explaining that evidence suggested David might have encountered someone dangerous, but that until they located him, they couldn't know the full circumstances or outcome of that encounter. She received the information with the hollow-eyed numbness of someone who'd passed through panic and fear into a state beyond either, where additional bad news just confirmed what she'd already begun accepting as the likely reality of her son's fate. She asked whether they thought David was dead, whether she should prepare herself for recovering a body rather than hoping for rescue, and Elridge gave the only answer that was both honest and humane given the uncertainties that still existed. He said they were continuing to search and investigate, that until they had definitive evidence they would proceed on the assumption that David could still be found alive, but that she should understand the situation was serious, and that the evidence they were finding suggested circumstances beyond simple misadventure in wilderness. It was a non-answer that conveyed everything while committing to nothing, and he saw in her eyes that she understood exactly what he was telling her beneath the careful professional language. The investigation into potential refuge locations for the squatter began immediately, with multiple teams conducting record searches and canvassing local residents who might have knowledge of informal camps or properties where someone could disappear from official attention. The work was painstaking and often frustrating, following leads that led nowhere and interviewing people whose information was incomplete or unreliable or deliberately misleading because they viewed law enforcement as intrusion rather than assistance. Elridge worked through the afternoon and into the evening, driving rough roads to remote properties and asking questions that were received with varying degrees of cooperation from residents who valued privacy and didn't appreciate officials showing up with inquiries about their neighbors or their own activities. Around 7 in the evening, a break came through a channel that Elridge hadn't anticipated. One of the tribal officers conducting canvass operations encountered an elder who lived in a traditional dwelling on reservation land about 5 miles northeast of Morrison Canyon. The elder mentioned that he'd seen smoke rising from an area near the boundary where no one should have been camping. Noticed it several days earlier but hadn't reported it because his relationship with tribal police was complicated by historical grievances and personal philosophy about governance and authority. When pressed about the smoke's location, he'd provided directions that were based on landmarks and traditional geographic references rather than GPS coordinates or road names, but which the officer had translated into approximate locations that could be checked. Elridge and Denton drove toward the area as sunset painted the sky in colors that would have been beautiful if the circumstances had allowed any appreciation for natural beauty. The route took them along barely maintained tracks that probably saw vehicle traffic only a few times each year, through terrain that was progressively more remote and isolated from any semblance of human development or oversight. The smoke location that the elder had described was in a small valley carved by ancient water flows, sheltered by rock formations that would make it invisible from most directions, and accessible only through narrow approaches that could easily be watched or defended by anyone wanting to maintain security. As they approached the valley's entrance, Elridge felt his instincts activate in ways that experience had taught him to respect. Something about the location felt wrong, not in any specific identifiable way, but in the accumulation of subtle indicators that suggested human presence and intentional concealment. There were tire tracks visible in softer soil, relatively fresh based on their definition and lack of erosion, indicating vehicles had been in the area recently despite its remoteness. There was disturbed vegetation along the approach route, branches broken and ground compacted in patterns consistent with repeated passage rather than single-event travel. And as they penetrated deeper into the valley, there was the faint smell of smoke and chemical processing. The same combination that had characterized the drug lab they'd raided earlier, but present here in concentrations that suggested a smaller-scale activity or better ventilation. They parked the vehicle approximately quarter-mile from where the elder had indicated the smoke originated, not wanting to announce their approach with engine noise that would carry clearly in the evening stillness. They proceeded on foot with weapons drawn and senses alert to any indication of threat or danger, moving carefully through terrain that could easily conceal ambush positions or lookout posts. The light was fading quickly now, the brief desert twilight transitioning toward full darkness, and they used the remaining visibility to navigate while knowing that if confrontation came, it would likely happen in conditions that favored whoever was familiar with the location over visitors approaching for the first time. The camp appeared through the dimness as a collection of improvised structures, tarps and plywood and salvaged materials assembled into shelters that provided minimal weather protection but could be abandoned quickly if necessary. There was a fire pit with embers still glowing, suggesting recent occupation, and scattered around the camp perimeter was the detritus of extended habitation, food containers and empty bottles, and the random accumulation of trash that people generated when they stopped caring about maintaining appearances. A vehicle was parked partially concealed under camouflage netting, an older pickup truck that looked functional despite visible rust and body damage. What made Elridge's breath catch was the presence of children's items among the camp's scattered contents. A small shoe, the mate to running shoes that David had been wearing according to Marina's description, lying near the fire pit as though it had been discarded or lost. A piece of fabric that matched the color and pattern of the shorts David had been wearing, torn and dirty, but recognizable. And most damning, a small backpack that Marina had mentioned David carrying, containing his handheld game and some snacks for the hike to the bathroom facilities that final evening. Denton immediately radioed for backup and additional resources, requesting tactical teams and medical support and forensic specialists, his voice tight with controlled urgency as he described what they'd found. Elridge moved carefully through the camp's perimeter, documenting with photographs and mental notes while avoiding disturbing evidence that would need to be processed by specialists. The camp appeared abandoned, no sounds of occupation or movement visible in the gathering darkness, but appearances could be misleading, and approaching too carelessly could trigger violence if someone was concealed and watching. They waited for backup to arrive, maintaining surveillance on the camp while light failed completely and darkness settled over the valley with the finality of a closing door. Through night vision equipment, the camp remained visible as a collection of green-tinged shapes and shadows, but detail was lost, and the sense of watching something that might change at any moment created tension that made every sound and movement feel potentially significant. Elridge thought about David, about whether he'd been in this camp and, if so, what had happened to him here. Whether the evidence they'd found meant he was dead or merely indicated he'd passed through on his way to somewhere else. The tactical team arrived around 9 o'clock. approaching with careful noise discipline and taking positions that surrounded the camp before beginning the process of clearing it structure by structure. The operation was similar to the morning's raid, but compressed into smaller space and complicated by darkness and uncertain terrain. Elridge watched from his overwatch position as the team flowed through the camp, calling out clear notifications as each shelter was searched and found empty. The camp was abandoned. Whoever had been here recently had departed, leaving behind evidence and belongings, but taking with them any living occupants, including potentially David if he'd been held here. The forensic processing began immediately despite the darkness, with portable lighting transforming the camp into an illuminated island in the surrounding blackness. Portis and her team worked through the items with systematic care, collecting and documenting each piece of potential evidence while building a picture of what had occurred in this location. The children's shoe was confirmed as matching David's other shoe still in his camping gear. The fabric was positively identified as coming from his shorts, and the backpack contained items that Marina verified belonged to her son. The evidence was conclusive that David had been at this camp, but it revealed nothing about what had happened to him here or where he might be now. What the forensic team found in one of the shelters made the investigation's trajectory shift in ways that Elridge immediately recognized as transforming this from a potential recovery operation into an active pursuit. There was documentation, handwritten notes, and receipts and communication records that suggested the camp had been used not just as a refuge for a single squatter, but as a coordination point for a broader network. The notes referenced locations and times and dollar amounts, the language of illegal commerce conducted by people who were careful, but not careful enough to avoid leaving traces that investigators could follow. More significantly, there were references to movement schedules and pickup locations, suggesting that whatever operation had been running from this camp involved transporting things or people across the reservation boundary into areas where federal and tribal jurisdiction became complicated. Denton assembled the investigative team in the camp's center and briefed them on what the documents suggested, that they were looking at something more organized than a single individual's criminal activity. The squatter who'd occupied the Morrison Canyon tent had apparently been part of a network that used remote camps and isolated properties to facilitate trafficking operations, moving drugs or people, or both, through routes that exploited jurisdictional gaps and the vastness of the territory that made comprehensive surveillance impossible. The network appeared to extend across multiple locations, with the Morrison Canyon area serving as one node in a larger system that would require extensive investigation to fully map and disrupt. The immediate question was whether David had been taken as part of this trafficking operation, whether his disappearance from the camping area had been opportunistic criminal behavior by someone who'd seen a vulnerable child and decided to incorporate him into whatever they were moving through their network. The alternative, that David's encounter with the squatter had been coincidental, and his current location was unrelated to the trafficking operation, seemed increasingly unlikely given the accumulating evidence. If he'd been taken into the network, his location could be anywhere along routes that stretched across state lines and into Mexico, destinations that would require coordination with multiple agencies and jurisdictions to search effectively. Marina was brought to the campsite against the advice of several team members who felt that exposing her to evidence locations would be traumatic and potentially compromising to the investigation. But she'd insisted with an intensity that made clear she would not be denied, and Elridge had supported her request because he understood that uncertainty and waiting were sometimes worse than confronting difficult truths directly. She stood at the camp's perimeter and looked at her son's belongings laid out for documentation and photography, her face expressionless in ways that suggested she'd moved beyond emotional response into some survival mode where feeling would have to wait until circumstances allowed the luxury of breaking down. She asked the question that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to answer definitively. Was David alive? Did the evidence suggest he'd survived whatever happened at this camp? Or should she prepare herself for the worst? Elridge looked at Denton before answering. seeking some guidance about how to present information that was simultaneously hopeful and deeply troubling, and saw in the federal agent's expression the same uncertainty about what honesty required in moments like this. Elridge chose his words carefully, understanding that what he said in this moment would stay with Marina for the rest of her life, regardless of what eventually happened with David. He explained that the evidence suggested David had been at the camp, that his belongings being left behind could mean several things ranging from him being moved to another location to the possibility that he'd escaped or been released. The absence of blood evidence at the camp, the lack of any signs of violence in the immediate area, these were reasons to maintain hope even as the investigation followed leads that might ultimately confirm the worst. He didn't say what both of them were thinking, that children taken into trafficking networks rarely emerged alive, that the statistics were brutally clear about outcomes in cases where victims disappeared into systems designed specifically to exploit and conceal. Marina absorbed the information with a nod that was mechanical rather than comprehending, her mind probably already moving through scenarios and possibilities that would torture her during every quiet moment for however long this search continued. She asked whether she could take the backpack, whether having something of David's would be possible, and Elridge had to explain that everything was evidence now and would need to be retained for processing and potential trial use. The practical cruelty of that reality, that she couldn't even hold her son's belongings while waiting to learn his fate, seemed to break through her numbness briefly. Her face crumpled before she regained control and turned away to compose herself in privacy that the assembled law enforcement personnel tried to grant by focusing on their work and pretending not to notice her distress. The investigation expanded rapidly as night progressed into the early hours of the following day. The documents found at the camp were analyzed and cross-referenced against databases of known trafficking operations, revealing connections that stretched across Arizona and into New Mexico and potentially beyond. The network appeared to use reservation boundary areas specifically because the jurisdictional complications made coordinated law enforcement response difficult and created gaps where illegal activity could flourish undetected for extended periods. Phone numbers found in the documentation led to additional suspects, some with prior arrests for human trafficking and drug distribution, others who appeared to be facilitators providing logistics and safe houses for operations that moved contraband and people through routes that avoided major highways and official checkpoints. Denton coordinated with FBI field offices across the Southwest, sharing information and requesting surveillance on properties and individuals connected to the network. The response was immediate and extensive, reflecting the federal priority given to human trafficking cases and the particular urgency that missing children created in bureaucratic systems that could move with surprising speed when properly motivated. Warrants were obtained for locations in 3 states. Tactical teams were mobilized for simultaneous raids designed to prevent suspects from being warned and destroying evidence. And the full apparatus of federal law enforcement was brought to bear on a network that had probably operated successfully for years, by staying small enough and dispersed enough to avoid attracting this level of attention. But all the coordination and resources and tactical precision couldn't change the fundamental reality that David's location remained unknown. The raids executed over the following 48 hours produced arrests and evidence seizures that would lead to prosecutions and likely significant prison sentences for those involved, but none of the detained individuals claimed knowledge of a specific child matching David's description. Some said nothing, exercising their right to silence and waiting for lawyers who would advise them that cooperation might reduce sentences, but would also require admitting to crimes that carried decades of incarceration. Others provided partial information, describing aspects of the network's operations in exchange for consideration during sentencing, but their knowledge was compartmentalized by design, and none could provide the specific intelligence that would lead directly to David. Elridge spent 3 days working nearly without sleep, following leads and conducting interviews and reviewing evidence as it accumulated from multiple sources. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated operation that had been moving people across the border region for at least 2 years, exploiting individuals desperate for entry into the United States or escaping situations in their home countries that made dangerous illegal transit seem preferable to staying. The operation had generated significant revenue for those running it while creating suffering for those being transported, cramped in vehicles and held in substandard conditions, and subjected to violence when they couldn't pay demanded fees or when they became liabilities that threatened operational security. Whether David had been incorporated into this system as a victim or had simply encountered it by accident and been eliminated as a witness remained unclear. The forensic evidence from the Morrison Canyon tent showed that someone had been seriously injured or killed there, the quantity and pattern of blood consistent with traumatic violence. But without a body or definitive DNA match to David, investigators couldn't confirm whether he'd been the victim or had witnessed violence done to someone else. The uncertainty was maddening from an investigative standpoint and devastating from a human perspective, leaving everyone involved unable to provide Marina with the closure that might allow her to begin processing grief or maintaining hope in ways that were grounded in reality rather than wishful thinking. On the 4th day after the camp discovery, a development occurred that redirected the investigation toward possibilities that were simultaneously encouraging and deeply troubling. A Border Patrol agent working near Douglas, Arizona, approximately 200 miles south of Morrison Canyon, reported encountering a group of suspected trafficking victims who'd been abandoned by their transporters after a vehicle breakdown. Among the group was a child, a boy approximately 8 years old who matched David's general description but couldn't communicate effectively due to trauma or language barriers. The agent had called for medical support and social services, standard procedure for handling trafficking victims, but had also flagged the case to FBI coordinators because of the potential connection to the Morrison Canyon investigation. Elridge and Denton drove to Douglas immediately, making the journey in under 4 hours by pushing speeds that were probably inadvisable but seemed justified by the possibility that they might be about to find David alive. Marina traveled separately with the victim advocate, prepared for reunion or disappointment but clearly holding on to hope that had been nearly extinguished by days of terrible news and dead ends. The drive gave Elridge time to think about what they might find, to prepare himself emotionally for various scenarios ranging from joyful recovery to the soul-crushing discovery that the child wasn't David, and they were back to searching with no promising leads. The Border Patrol station in Douglas was a utilitarian facility that processed hundreds of encounters monthly, its holding areas and interview rooms designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The child who might be David was in a medical examination room receiving care for dehydration and minor injuries, attended by a doctor and a social worker who specialized in trafficking victim services. Elridge and Denton were briefed before being allowed to see the child, told that he was physically stable but psychologically fragile, responsive to basic questions, but showing signs of trauma that would require extensive therapeutic intervention regardless of his identity or circumstances. The moment when Marina was brought into the examination room would stay with Elridge for the rest of his career, one of those crystalline memories that retained perfect clarity regardless of how much time passed. He watched through an observation window as she entered and saw the child, watched her face cycle through hope and recognition, and then the terrible collapse into despair as she realized this wasn't David. The child looked similar, was approximately the right age and build, but was clearly a different person with different features and different responses. Marina's legs seemed to fail her, and she sat down heavily in a chair that someone positioned behind her just in time, her hands covering her face as she absorbed this latest crushing disappointment. The child, who wasn't David, was eventually identified through fingerprint databases as a victim who'd been reported missing from New Mexico 3 months earlier, taken during circumstances that suggested family abduction, but had actually been trafficking operation. His recovery was a victory that would allow reunion with his actual family and potentially provide intelligence about the network's operations. But it did nothing to help find David and represented another dead end in an investigation that was accumulating more questions than answers despite the resources being applied to it. Elridge drove Marina back toward Morrison Canyon in silence, both of them too exhausted and emotionally depleted for conversation that would require energy neither possessed. He thought about the randomness of survival in trafficking situations, how some victims were recovered alive while others simply vanished into systems that consumed them without leaving traces that investigators could follow. He thought about the geographic scale of the network they were fighting, the hundreds of miles and countless locations where David could be held or hidden or worse, and about the limitations of law enforcement resources even when cases received priority attention and multi-agency coordination. The investigation continued for weeks, then months, generating periodic updates that Marina received through official channels and occasional direct communication from Elridge when developments seemed significant enough to warrant personal notification. Additional arrests were made as investigators traced the network's connections and financial flows, building cases that would eventually result in prosecutions for trafficking and related crimes. Properties were searched, and vehicles were seized, and digital evidence was analyzed, creating a comprehensive picture of how the operation had functioned and who had participated at various levels. But none of it led to David. The forensic analysis of evidence from the Morrison Canyon tent eventually confirmed that the blood belonged to two individuals. One matched to a trafficking victim who'd been reported missing from Texas and whose remains were discovered in a shallow grave approximately 10 miles from the canyon. The second blood source was never definitively identified, the DNA not matching any profiles in available databases, leaving open the possibility that it belonged to David or to another unknown victim whose disappearance had never been officially reported. The tent itself was traced through manufacturing codes and sales records to a camping supply store in Phoenix, but the purchase had been cash transaction without identifying information and led nowhere useful. The squatter who'd occupied the Morrison Canyon camp was never located, his identity remaining unknown despite extensive investigation and the circulation of composite sketches based on Marina's brief sighting. He'd either gone deep underground or had been eliminated by others in the network, who viewed him as a liability after law enforcement attention focused on his activities. His disappearance was itself frustrating, representing a potential source of information that might have provided crucial leads about David's fate, but who remained beyond reach despite the resources dedicated to finding him. Elridge returned to routine patrol duties eventually, the Morrison Canyon case remaining open but no longer consuming his full attention as new incidents and responsibilities demanded response. He drove the boundary roads and conducted welfare checks and responded to calls, the familiar rhythms of tribal police work providing structure that helped manage the sense of failure that came from not finding David despite everything they'd tried. He thought about the case often, running through the investigation in his mind and questioning decisions that had been made, wondering if different choices at critical moments might have led to different outcomes. Marina stayed in the area for 6 months before returning to Tucson, unable to leave while there remained any possibility that David might be found nearby, but eventually accepting that continuing to wait in Morrison Canyon served no purpose beyond prolonging her agony. She established a foundation dedicated to finding missing children and supporting families dealing with similar traumas, transforming her grief into action that might help others even if it couldn't bring back her son. Elridge attended the foundation's launch event and saw in her eyes the permanent damage that the experience had inflicted, the way loss had changed her into someone who would never again experience joy without it being shadowed by absence. 2 years after David's disappearance, Elridge was conducting a routine patrol near the eastern boundary when he encountered a group of hikers who mentioned finding something unusual in a remote canyon approximately 15 miles from Morrison. They described it as a child's shoe, weathered by exposure but clearly not old enough to have been there for decades. Elridge felt his chest tighten as he requested the specific location and began the process of accessing terrain that would require hiking because no roads reached the area the hikers described. He notified Denton, who was still with the FBI but had moved to a different assignment, and together they made the journey to the location on a cold December morning when the desert air was crisp and the sky was impossibly blue. The shoe was there as described, a running shoe that matched the brand and size that David had been wearing, but was too degraded by weather to allow definitive identification without forensic analysis. It was positioned at the base of a cliff face, partially concealed by rocks in ways that suggested it might have been placed there deliberately rather than simply lost. Elridge photographed it from multiple angles and collected it using proper evidence protocols, maintaining chain of custody even though he knew that 2 years of exposure would likely have destroyed any biological evidence that might have confirmed whether it belonged to David. They searched the surrounding area methodically, looking for any other traces or remains that might indicate this was where David's journey had ended. They found nothing definitive, just the ambiguous shoe that could have belonged to him or to any number of other children who'd passed through the area over the years. The forensic analysis eventually determined that the shoe was consistent with David's size and brand preference, but couldn't exclude other potential owners, leaving it as another piece of suggestive but inconclusive evidence in a case built entirely from fragments that never quite assembled into complete answers. Elridge kept the case file on his desk, adding to it periodically when new information emerged, or when developments in related investigations suggested potential connections to David's disappearance. The file grew thick with documents and photographs and witness statements, a paper monument to efforts that had been extensive and thorough, but ultimately unsuccessful in achieving the goal that mattered most. He would review it sometimes during quiet moments, rereading reports and examining crime scene photos, searching for details that might have been missed or connections that weren't obvious during the initial investigation's urgency and chaos. Years later, working as a supervisor training new tribal officers, Elridge would use the Morrison Canyon case as a teaching example when discussing the complexities of boundary jurisdiction and trafficking investigations. He would walk recruits through the timeline and decisions, explaining the reasoning behind tactical choices and the coordination required when cases spanned multiple agencies and territories. But he would never share the full emotional weight of the case, never quite convey what it felt like to know that somewhere in the desert vastness, a child had disappeared into systems designed specifically to exploit the vulnerable and conceal evidence of crimes that destroyed lives. He would sometimes drive past Morrison Canyon during patrols, slowing at the access road and looking toward the camping area that had returned to normal use by recreationists who probably never knew what had happened there. The abandoned campsite had been dismantled and removed, the tent and its grim evidence long since processed and stored in evidence facilities. The area looked peaceful in the way that places do when trauma has been absorbed and time has passed, showing no visible scars from events that had permanently altered everyone involved. Marina sent occasional updates about the Foundation's work, brief emails describing cases where they'd helped families or contributed to investigations that resulted in recoveries. She never mentioned David directly in these communications, as though speaking his name would give power to the loss that had defined her existence since that June evening when he'd walked away from their campsite and never returned. Elridge would read the updates and respond with appropriate acknowledgement, maintaining connection across years and distance because it felt like the only memorial he could offer to a child he'd never met, but whose absence had become a permanent weight he carried. The network that had operated through Morrison Canyon and the surrounding boundary areas was eventually dismantled through prosecutions that sent key members to federal prison for terms that would ensure most died incarcerated. The cases were cited as examples of successful multi-agency coordination and represented victories that justified the resources invested in combating trafficking operations. But for Elridge, the success felt hollow, because the metric that mattered most, finding David and bringing him home, had never been achieved despite everything they'd done and everyone they'd arrested. He would lie awake some nights thinking about possibilities, about scenarios where David had survived somehow and was living under a different identity somewhere beyond their searching, or where he'd escaped his captors and been taken in by someone who'd never reported his presence to authorities. These thoughts were probably fantasies, wishful thinking that ignored statistical realities about trafficking victim outcomes, but they were preferable to confronting the more likely truth that David had died shortly after being taken, and that his remains were somewhere in the desert vastness waiting to be discovered by chance, or erosion, or never found at all. The boundary between the reservation and the surrounding territories remained porous and problematic. The jurisdictional gaps that had allowed the trafficking network to flourish still present despite increased coordination between agencies. New operations would emerge to replace those that were disrupted. New criminals would recognize the same opportunities that their predecessors had exploited, and the cycle would continue because the fundamental conditions that enabled trafficking, poverty and desperation, and institutional gaps persisted regardless of individual enforcement successes. Elridge understood this with the kind of clear-eyed realism that came from years of working cases where victories were temporary and problems were systemic. He'd learned not to measure success by whether evil was eliminated, but by whether individual victims were helped, and whether the constant pressure of enforcement made criminal operations marginally more difficult and less profitable. It was an unsatisfying calculus that required accepting that perfect solutions were impossible, and that doing the work meant living with failures that would never be fully reconciled or resolved. The last time he visited Morrison Canyon was 5 years after David's disappearance, during a cool spring morning when wildflowers were blooming in improbable colors across the desert landscape. He parked at the camping area and walked the trail to where the bathroom facilities stood, following the route that David had taken on that final evening. The distance seemed impossibly short, maybe 200 yards, the kind of walk that should have been safe and routine, but had somehow led to tragedy that remained incompletely understood despite thousands of investigative hours. He stood at the spot where he imagined the encounter might have occurred, where a child, walking alone at dusk, had crossed paths with someone who'd seen opportunity or threat, or simply hadn't cared about consequences beyond immediate circumstances. He tried to picture what had happened, how David had been taken from this place to the tent, where violence occurred, to the camp where his belongings were abandoned, to whatever final destination claimed him. The narrative had gaps that would probably never be filled, spaces where evidence ended and speculation began, and where the truth remained hidden behind barriers that investigation couldn't penetrate. The desert wind moved through the canyon with a sound like distant voices, carrying scents of creosote and dust and the subtle perfume of flowers that bloomed briefly before heat killed them. Elridge stood in that wind and thought about all the cases that haunted officers, the ones that remained unsolved despite best efforts, the victims who were never found and families who were never given closure. Morrison Canyon had become one of those cases for him, a permanent reminder of limitations and failures and the terrible randomness of who suffered and who escaped, and who would ever know what really happened in moments when darkness consumed light. He drove away from Morrison Canyon that morning, knowing he wouldn't return, that the place held nothing but memories that served no purpose beyond causing pain. The case would remain open in official records, periodically reviewed when new information emerged, or when cold case units conducted systematic examinations of unsolved disappearances. But active investigation had long since moved to other priorities, other victims, Other families waiting for answers that might or might not come depending on chance and persistence, and the occasional breakthrough that made years of futile effort suddenly worthwhile. Marina's foundation continued operating, helping families and funding investigations and maintaining public awareness about trafficking and missing children. Elridge contributed to it annually, modest donations that probably made no material difference but felt like the least he could do given that finding David had been his responsibility and he'd failed despite everything he'd tried. The guilt was irrational. He'd followed procedures and made reasonable decisions and worked the case as thoroughly as resources allowed, but rationality didn't eliminate the feeling that somehow he should have done more, or seen connections sooner, or prevented the outcome through better choices at critical moments. The boundary roads continued their work of dividing and connecting, marking territories and enabling passage, creating the jurisdictional complexity that made the reservation both sovereign and vulnerable. Elridge patrolled those roads and enforced what laws he could, and knew that beyond his sight and beyond his authority things were happening that he could affect only marginally, if at all. It was the nature of the work, accepting limitations while maintaining effort. Understanding failure was inevitable, while refusing to let inevitability excuse inaction. Years accumulated, and David's case receded into the background of daily operations. Still present, but no longer commanding attention that newer tragedies demanded. Elridge wondered sometimes what had happened to the boy, whether his final moments had been terrified or mercifully brief, whether he'd understood what was happening or had died confused about why the adults around him were causing him harm. These thoughts served no investigative purpose, but arose unbidden during quiet moments when the mind wandered into territories that offered no comfort or resolution. The tent stains and the camp evidence and the shoe found years later remained in storage facilities, preserved against the possibility that future technology or investigative breakthroughs might extract information that current methods couldn't reveal. But storage was expensive and space was limited, and eventually decisions would be made about what to retain and what to dispose of, practical choices that would transform evidence into trash because resources couldn't be justified for cases where prospects of resolution had faded beyond realistic hope. Elridge carried Morrison Canyon with him into retirement, one of several cases that had marked his career with the permanent weight of unfinished business. He would see news reports about missing children and feel the old familiar tightness in his chest, the recognition that somewhere officers were beginning investigations that might end successfully or might join the growing collection of unsolved cases that represented failures both individual and systemic. He would hope those officers would be luckier or smarter or more thorough than he'd been, knowing that luck and intelligence and thoroughness sometimes weren't enough when confronting systems designed specifically to frustrate investigation and conceal truth. The desert kept its secrets with the patience of geological time, concealing beneath sand and rock the evidence of everything that happened within its boundaries. Somewhere in that vastness, David's story had ended. The details known only to those who'd caused it, and to whatever consciousness might persist beyond death, if such things existed beyond human need for meaning and justice. The living were left with fragments and questions, and the permanent wound of absence that time might scab over but would never truly heal. Marina grew old, waiting for news that never came, her foundation's work continuing even as she aged into someone who existed primarily through grief and dedication to ensuring other families didn't endure what she'd experienced. Elridge would see her occasionally at law enforcement conferences or charity events, and they would exchange the kind of careful conversation that people shared when connected by trauma too deep to discuss directly. She never asked whether he still thought about David, never needed to because the answer was obvious in the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes when they spoke. The Morrison Canyon camping area operated normally, hosting families and hikers who sought recreation in desert wilderness without knowing that their presence was made possible by tragedy that had occurred there. Life continued its work of covering wounds and moving forward because stopping meant death, and forward motion was the only option available to those who'd survived when others hadn't. And somewhere in the archives and evidence rooms and cold case files, David existed as paper and photographs and DNA samples, reduced to bureaucratic artifacts of a life that had been too brief and had ended too mysteriously to allow closure or peace. Elridge knew those files would outlast him, would survive in storage long after everyone who'd worked the case was dead, permanent monuments to failure that future investigators might someday solve or might simply inherit as their own burden of unresolved questions. The boundary remained, dividing and connecting, creating the spaces where law ended and something else began. Elridge had spent his career working that boundary and had learned that the line between order and chaos was thinner and more permeable than comfortable society wanted to acknowledge. Morrison Canyon had taught him that lesson with brutal clarity, demonstrating that all the training and resources and dedication in the world sometimes couldn't prevent darkness from consuming light in moments too quick to prevent and too complete to repair. He accepted it finally, not with peace, but with the resignation that came from understanding some questions would never be answered, and some losses would never be recovered. David was gone, into systems or desert or death, and no amount of investigation would change that fundamental reality. The work continued because it had to, because giving up meant accepting that evil faced no resistance, and that victims received no advocacy, and that the boundary between civilization and chaos would shift further toward darkness if good people stopped trying to hold the line. But trying didn't guarantee success, and holding the line didn't prevent breaches. And sometimes, despite everything, a child walked away from a campsite and never returned, and all anyone could do was document the failure and carry its weight and hope that future efforts would somehow achieve what past dedication couldn't. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Jonas Begay got the call about the body on Highway 17, a relentless autumn storm that turned the unpaved reservation roads into rivers of red mud and made travel dangerous even for vehicles equipped with proper tires and experienced drivers who understood how quickly conditions could deteriorate in the high country of western New Mexico. He'd been a tribal sergeant for 12 years, working out of the Rama substation that served the scattered communities along the reservation's northern boundary, and he'd learned to read weather patterns with the kind of attention that came from responding to accidents and emergencies where minutes could mean the difference between rescue and recovery. This storm had the feel of something that would last another day at minimum, possibly 2 if the system stalled over the mountains like the forecasters were predicting, and every hour it continued meant more roads becoming impassable and more areas being cut off from emergency services. The call came through dispatch just after 6 in the morning, early enough that Jonas was still at home drinking coffee and watching the rain sheet across his kitchen window in waves that obscured everything beyond 20 feet. The voice on the radio was Lucero, the night shift dispatcher who should have been heading home but was staying late because the day shift couldn't make it through flooded crossings to reach the station. She reported that a motorist had called in about what appeared to be a body lying in the roadway approximately 8 miles north of the Highway 53 junction. Visible in headlights but positioned in a way that suggested it hadn't been there long because no other vehicles had reported it during the night despite regular traffic on that route. The caller had been too frightened to stop and investigate closely, had simply noted the location and continued driving until cell service was strong enough to make the report, a decision that Jonas understood even if it complicated the response because now they were working with second-hand information and approximate coordinates rather than confirmed details. He acknowledged the call and began the process of getting dressed in rain gear and gathering equipment that would be needed for whatever he found at the scene. The location was in his patrol sector, technically on reservation land but close enough to the boundary that jurisdiction would likely involve coordination with McKinley County Sheriff's Office if the incident proved to be serious. He radioed for backup and was told that the nearest available unit was at least an hour away dealing with a stranded family whose vehicle had slid off a forest road into a drainage ditch. The isolation was typical of reservation policing in remote areas, where distances were measured in travel time rather than miles, and where single officers routinely handled situations that urban departments would assign multiple units to address. The drive to Highway 17 took 40 minutes. Longer than it should have under normal conditions, but reasonable, given the state of the roads and the visibility that was reduced to perhaps 30 yards, even with headlights and wipers working at maximum speed. Jonas drove with the careful attention that came from experience, watching for washouts and debris that could disable a vehicle or trap it in mud deep enough that extraction would require tow trucks that weren't available during weather like this. The landscape around him was invisible beyond the immediate road surface, the familiar landmarks and reference points erased by rain and low clouds that had settled into the valleys and refused to lift, despite the approaching sunrise that was happening somewhere above the cloud cover, but providing no useful illumination at ground level. Highway 17 was a two-lane road that connected several small communities and served as a primary route for residents accessing services in Grants and Gallup. It was paved but narrow, with steep drop-offs on one side where the terrain fell away toward creek beds that were probably raging with runoff from the sustained rainfall. Jonas slowed as he approached the reported location, scanning the roadway ahead for anything that might be a human form, or might be debris or an animal carcass that the caller had misidentified in the poor visibility and understandable stress of encountering something unexpected on a dark, rainy highway. He saw it perhaps 50 yards ahead, a dark shape lying partially in the southbound lane with one arm extended as though reaching for something. Even from distance and through rain-blurred windshield, the posture looked wrong in ways that suggested this was, indeed, a human body rather than some other explanation. Jonas activated his emergency lights and positioned his patrol truck to block the lane and provide some protection from traffic that might approach without seeing the obstruction in time to stop safely. He radioed his position and situation to dispatch, informing Lucero that he had a confirmed body and would be approaching on foot to assess the scene and determine what resources would be needed for proper investigation and recovery. The rain was cold when he stepped out of the truck, driven by wind that was gusting hard enough to make standing upright require conscious effort. Water ran down his face despite the hood of his rain jacket, and within seconds his pants were soaked from mid-thigh down where the jacket's protection ended. He approached the body carefully, scanning the surrounding area for any indication of how it had come to be here, whether this was a pedestrian struck by a vehicle or someone who'd been placed here after dying elsewhere, or something more complicated that wouldn't be immediately obvious from external observation. The deceased was a man, probably in his late 20s or early 30s based on what Jonas could see of his face and hands. He was lying on his back with his head turned slightly to one side, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that were completely soaked and plastered to his body by the rain. There were no obvious signs of vehicular impact, no tire marks on the body or clothing, and no visible trauma that would explain death from collision. What Jonas noticed immediately was the man's hands, both of which showed defensive wounds, cuts and abrasions on the palms and fingers that suggested he'd been trying to protect himself from something or someone shortly before death. He knelt beside the body despite the water pooling on the road surface, conducting the kind of preliminary examination that training required, even though he knew this was now a crime scene that would need proper forensic processing. The defensive wounds were recent, probably sustained within hours of death based on their appearance and the minimal bleeding that had occurred before the heart stopped pumping. There was bruising around the neck that was faint but visible, suggesting possible strangulation or compression of the throat, and when Jonas carefully lifted the shirt to check for additional trauma, he found what looked like a stab wound in the lower left abdomen, the kind of injury that would cause internal bleeding and death over a period of time rather than immediately. The rain was washing away evidence with every passing minute. Any blood that might have been on the road surface, or the body's clothing diluted and dispersed by water that was running in streams toward the drainage ditches. Jonas photographed what he could see using his phone, documenting the body's position and visible injuries while knowing that the images would be poor quality, given the lighting and weather conditions, but better than nothing if physical evidence continued degrading before proper crime scene technicians could arrive. He was searching the immediate area for any personal effects or weapons when he noticed tire tracks in the mud on the road's shoulder, fresh impressions that hadn't been completely erased by rain yet, and that showed a pattern suggesting a vehicle had pulled off the pavement and then returned to the road. The tracks led to a spot approximately 20 feet from where the body lay, close enough to suggest connection, but not necessarily proving that whoever had left the tracks was involved in the death. Jonas photographed the tracks and used his flashlight to follow them back along the shoulder, finding where they emerged from the road surface and noting that the vehicle appeared to have been a truck based on the width and depth of the impressions. By the time backup arrived in the form of a tribal officer named Hastian, who'd finished with the stranded family and made the drive through deteriorating conditions, Jonas had established a preliminary perimeter and gathered what information the scene could provide, given the weather's destructive effects on evidence. Together, they erected a portable shelter over the body, a tarp stretched between support poles that would at least prevent additional rain from directly striking the deceased, while they waited for the medical investigator and crime scene unit that were being dispatched from Gallup, but would take time to arrive given road conditions and distance. Hastian was a younger officer, maybe 5 years on the force, but he had good instincts and didn't need to be told what to do in situations like this. He began documenting the scene with systematic photographs, while Jonas attempted to identify the deceased through visual examination and the few personal items that were found in the man's pockets. There was a wallet containing approximately $40 in cash and a tribal identification card that listed the name as Marcus Tohani, age 28, with an address in Fence Lake, which was a small community about 15 miles east of their current location. The discovery that the deceased was tribal member meant the investigation would remain primarily under tribal police jurisdiction rather than being handed off to county authorities, a detail that simplified some aspects of the case while complicating others, given the limited resources available to tribal law enforcement for major crime investigation. Jonas had seen the name Tohani before. It was a family that had deep roots in the area and was known to him through various official and community contacts over the years. He tried to place Marcus specifically but couldn't immediately recall encounters that would have brought them into contact, though that wasn't unusual given that the reservation population was large enough that a sergeant couldn't know everyone personally. What troubled him more than the identification itself was the defensive wounds and the apparent violence that had preceded death, suggesting this wasn't a random incident or accident, but deliberate harm committed by someone who'd had close physical contact with Marcus in the period before he died. The medical investigator arrived around 9 o'clock, driving a county vehicle through conditions that were worsening as the storm intensified rather than breaking up as forecasters had hoped. She was a contract specialist who worked for several agencies across the region, experienced in death investigation but not specifically trained in homicide work, and her preliminary assessment confirmed what Jonas had already suspected. Marcus had died from blood loss caused by the abdominal wound, probably within 1 to 3 hours of being stabbed based on the limited bleeding at the wound site and the body's condition. The defensive wounds suggested struggle, and the neck bruising indicated someone had attempted to restrain him by gripping his throat, though whether that had contributed to death or had simply been part of the assault that preceded the fatal stabbing couldn't be determined without autopsy. The body was photographed extensively before being moved, documented from every angle that might preserve information about positioning and injury patterns, then carefully lifted onto a transport gurney and secured under waterproof covering for the journey to the medical examiner's facility in Albuquerque where autopsy would be conducted. Jonas watched the transport vehicle depart and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling over him, the understanding that what happened next would depend largely on the quality of investigation he conducted over the coming hours and days. Homicides on the reservation were relatively rare compared to other crimes, but when they occurred, they demanded the same thoroughness and procedural care that urban departments brought to similar cases, even though the resources and specialized expertise available were a fraction of what larger agencies could deploy. He stood in the rain after the body was gone and considered what he knew and what remained unknown. Marcus Tohaney had died violently on a remote highway during a storm that had kept most people indoors and off the roads, killed by someone who'd been close enough to stab him and who'd struggled with him before delivering the fatal wound. The location suggested the death hadn't occurred here, or if it had, there should have been more blood visible despite the rain's cleaning effects, which meant Marcus had probably been dumped after dying elsewhere. The tire tracks suggested a vehicle had stopped briefly to dispose of the body, and the timing suggested this had happened during the night when traffic was minimal and the likelihood of witnesses was low. What Jonas couldn't yet determine was why Marcus had been killed and who had reason to want him dead. Those questions would require investigation that went beyond the physical crime scene, interviewing family and associates, and building a picture of Marcus's life that might reveal conflicts or relationships that had turned violent. It was the kind of work that required patience and careful attention to details that seemed insignificant initially but accumulated into patterns that eventually pointed toward suspects and motives. He drove toward Fence Lake through rain that showed no signs of letting up, the windshield wipers struggling to keep pace with water that was falling in sheets now rather than simple drops. The community was small, maybe 200 residents spread across an area that would be considered rural even by reservation standards, and finding Marcus's residence would require asking directions from locals who might or might not be willing to share information with law enforcement depending on their personal histories and relationships. Jonas had learned over 12 years that tribal policing required different approaches than what he'd been taught in the academy, that communities had their own systems of justice and authority that sometimes aligned with official law enforcement and sometimes operated in parallel or opposition, depending on circumstances and the specific individuals involved. The address on Marcus's identification led to a small house on the southern edge of Fence Lake, a modest structure that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and maintained adequately but not lavishly. There were 2 vehicles in the yard, both older model trucks that appeared functional, and lights were visible through windows despite the early hours suggesting someone was awake inside. Jonas parked and sat for a moment preparing himself for the notification he was about to deliver. The conversation that would transform someone's ordinary morning into the worst day of their life, and would start them on a journey of grief and loss that would never fully end, regardless of whether the investigation eventually brought justice or closure. The woman who answered the door was in her early 30s, wearing a bathrobe over pajamas and holding a coffee mug that she'd probably been drinking from when Jonas knocked. Her expression shifted from curiosity to concern the moment she saw his uniform and the patrol truck parked in her yard. The universal recognition that police presence at dawn rarely brought good news. Jonas introduced himself and asked if she was related to Marcus Tohaney, watching her face carefully for reactions that might tell him things beyond what her words would reveal. She identified herself as Eveline Tohaney, Marcus's sister, and confirmed that this was his residence, though he'd been staying with friends in Grants for the past week and wasn't currently home. Jonas asked if they could speak inside, a request that Eveline granted with visible reluctance, stepping back from the doorway and gesturing him into a living room that was modestly furnished but clean and organized in ways that suggested someone who took pride in their home despite limited resources. He waited until they were both seated before delivering the notification. using the direct language that training recommended because euphemisms only prolonged the agony and created confusion that made processing the information more difficult. He told her that Marcus had been found deceased on Highway 17 earlier that morning, that the circumstances suggested homicide, and that he was beginning an investigation that would require her cooperation and any information she could provide about Marcus's recent activities and associations. Eveline's reaction was not what Jonas expected. Instead of the immediate grief or shock that usually accompanied death notifications, her face went through a sequence of expressions that included something that looked almost like resignation, as though this news was terrible but not entirely surprising. She set down her coffee mug with careful deliberation and asked how Marcus had died, whether it had been quick, whether he'd suffered. Jonas gave her the minimal details that he could share without compromising the investigation, explaining that Marcus had sustained injuries consistent with physical assault and that death had probably occurred within a few hours of those injuries being inflicted. He didn't mention the specific nature of the wounds or the defensive injuries because those details weren't necessary for Eveline's understanding and might become important later if the investigation revealed she had information relevant to identifying the killer. She absorbed this information in silence for perhaps 30 seconds, staring at her hands which were clasped tightly in her lap. And when she spoke again, her voice had the flat quality of someone forcing themselves to remain functional despite emotional trauma. She said that Marcus had been having problems with someone, that there'd been threats and escalating tensions over the past few months, and that she'd warned him to stay away from Fence Lake until things settled down, but he'd refused to listen because he believed running from conflict only made it worse. The information immediately shifted the investigation's direction, transforming this from a case where motive and suspects would need to be developed through extensive background work into one where there were already known conflicts that warranted immediate investigation. Jonas asked who had been threatening Marcus, what the conflict was about, and whether Eveline knew of any specific incidents that had occurred recently. Her answer revealed layers of complexity that made Jonas realize this case was going to involve navigating family politics and historical grievances that extended beyond simple criminal investigation. The person Marcus had been in conflict with was his cousin, a man named Raymond Tohaney, who lived about 3 miles outside Fence Lake and who'd been involved in a property dispute with Marcus that had started as a disagreement about inherited land and had escalated into something more personal and violent over the past year. The dispute centered on a parcel of land that had belonged to their grandfather, approximately 40 acres of grazing land that had never been formally divided among heirs after the old man died 15 years earlier. Marcus and Raymond had both used portions of the land for running cattle, operating under an informal arrangement that worked as long as both parties respected boundaries and maintained civility. But about 18 months ago, Raymond had begun claiming that the entire parcel should be his because he was the eldest grandson and because he'd been the one caring for their grandfather in his final years. Marcus had disputed this claim, arguing that inheritance should be divided equally among all grandchildren regardless of birth order or caregiving responsibilities, and the disagreement had progressed from verbal arguments to physical confrontations, to threats that had become increasingly explicit and concerning. Eveline explained that the tribal court had been involved, that there'd been hearings and mediation attempts, but that the case had stalled in bureaucratic processes that moved slowly and didn't address the immediate tensions between the two men. Marcus had filed for a protection order after Raymond showed up at his workplace in Grants and threatened him in front of witnesses, but the order had been granted only temporarily pending a full hearing that kept getting postponed due to scheduling conflicts and the court's backlog of cases. The most recent incident had occurred about 2 weeks earlier, when Marcus had gone to check on his cattle and found several of them shot dead, execution-style killings that appeared designed to send a message rather than serve any practical purpose. Jonas took detailed notes while Eveline spoke, documenting names and dates and the sequence of events that had led to the current situation. He asked whether Marcus had reported the cattle killings to tribal police, and Eveline confirmed that he had, that there was an open investigation though no charges had been filed, because proving who'd killed the animals was difficult without witnesses or physical evidence linking Raymond to the scene. The investigating officer had been someone from the Grants substation rather than Jonas's unit, which explained why he hadn't been aware of the ongoing conflict when he'd first identified Marcus at the highway scene. The information about Raymond immediately made him the primary suspect in Marcus's death, but Jonas knew that jumping to conclusions without proper investigation was how cases got compromised and prosecutions failed. He needed to establish Raymond's whereabouts during the relevant time period, needed to determine whether there was physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, needed to build a timeline and gather witness statements that would support charges if the evidence pointed in that direction. He asked Eveline whether she knew where Raymond had been the previous night, whether there'd been any recent contact between the cousins, and she said that Marcus had mentioned seeing Raymond's truck near the highway junction 2 days earlier, but hadn't spoken to him and had deliberately avoided any interaction. Jonas left Eveline with the victim advocate's contact information and a promise that he would keep her informed as the investigation progressed. Standard procedure that helped families cope with the immediate aftermath of loss, while also maintaining lines of communication that might prove useful if additional information needed to be gathered. He sat in his patrol truck for several minutes after leaving the house, organizing his thoughts and planning the next steps of an investigation that was already revealing itself to be more complicated than a simple homicide. Family disputes were always difficult to investigate because they involved relationships and histories that outsiders couldn't fully understand, and because witnesses were often reluctant to provide information that might incriminate relatives regardless of what crimes had been committed. The drive to Raymond Tohaney's property took him along muddy roads that were deteriorating rapidly as the rain continued its relentless assault on surfaces that were never designed to handle this much water for this long. Jonas drove carefully, aware that getting stuck would not only delay the investigation but would also put him in a vulnerable position if Raymond proved to be dangerous or uncooperative. The property appeared through the rain as a cluster of buildings arranged around a central yard, a main house that looked relatively new and well-maintained, several outbuildings that appeared to be used for equipment storage, and a corral area where cattle were visible, standing in mud and rain, looking miserable. Raymond's truck was parked near the house, a newer model Ford that matched the description Eveline had provided, and that showed mud on the tires and wheel wells consistent with recent travel on unpaved roads. Jonas parked his patrol vehicle in a position that would allow quick departure if necessary and approached the house with the heightened awareness that came from knowing he was about to confront a potential murder suspect who had history of violence and who might react unpredictably to law enforcement presence. He knocked on the door and waited, noting the security camera mounted above the entrance and the reinforced door frame that suggested someone concerned about home security or possibly about law enforcement entry. Raymond answered after perhaps 30 seconds, a man in his late 30s with the solid build of someone who did physical labor regularly, and the wary expression of someone who'd had enough interactions with police to know that their presence rarely meant anything good. Jonas identified himself and explained that he was investigating Marcus Tohaney's death, watching Raymond's face carefully for reactions that might indicate guilt or foreknowledge. What he saw was complex, a flash of something that could have been surprise or could have been carefully performed simulation of surprise, followed by a neutral mask that revealed nothing about what Raymond was actually thinking or feeling. Jonas asked where Raymond had been the previous night, framing the question as routine rather than accusatory despite the fact that they both understood this was an alibi check. Raymond said he'd been home alone, that he'd spent the evening working on equipment repairs in one of his outbuildings and had gone to bed around 10 o'clock, sleeping through the night and waking at his usual time around 5:30. It was an alibi that couldn't be easily verified or disproved. The kind of statement that people gave when they either had nothing to hide or were smart enough to avoid claims that could be checked and potentially contradicted. Jonas asked whether Raymond owned any knives or bladed weapons, and saw the first real emotion cross the man's face, a tightening around the eyes that suggested Raymond understood the question's implications and didn't like where this conversation was heading. He said he had several knives, that anyone who worked with cattle and equipment owned cutting tools, and that Jonas was welcome to look at them if he had warrant authorizing search of the property. The response was legally correct, but also evasive, neither confirming nor denying anything specific while asserting rights that would require Jonas to either develop probable cause for warrant or abandon that line of inquiry. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, Jonas asking questions about Raymond's relationship with Marcus and the property dispute and the recent cattle killings. Raymond providing answers that were minimally responsive and carefully worded to avoid admissions that could be used against him. It was clear that Raymond either had legal advice or natural understanding of how to interact with law enforcement without incriminating himself, and Jonas knew that getting useful information from this interview was unlikely without leverage that he didn't currently possess. He concluded the conversation by informing Raymond that the investigation was ongoing and that there would likely be additional questions, then left with the distinct impression that he'd just spoken to someone who knew more than he was saying, but who wasn't going to make the mistake of revealing it without being compelled. The tribal police station in Rama was a small facility that served primarily as administrative office and dispatch center rather than full-service law enforcement complex. Jonas arrived there around noon, having spent the morning conducting interviews and gathering initial information, and immediately began the process of coordinating with other agencies and resources that would be needed for thorough homicide investigation. He contacted the tribal prosecutor's office to brief them on the case and discuss what would be required for arrest warrant if evidence developed pointing definitively toward Raymond or another suspect. He reached out to the FBI's Violent Crimes Unit that had jurisdiction over major felonies on tribal land, knowing that federal involvement might eventually be necessary if the case went to trial, and that establishing early coordination would make that transition smoother. The medical examiner's preliminary report arrived via email around 2 in the afternoon, confirming the initial assessment that Marcus had died from blood loss caused by the abdominal wound and providing additional details about the nature and severity of his injuries. The stab wound had been inflicted with a blade approximately 4 to 6 inches long, driven upward into the abdomen with enough force to penetrate deep into the peritoneal cavity and sever blood vessels that caused rapid internal bleeding. The defensive wounds on Marcus's hands were consistent with attempting to grab or deflect a knife during an assault, and the bruising on his neck was determined to have occurred peri-mortem, meaning Marcus had been alive when someone gripped his throat hard enough to leave those marks. What Jonas found most significant in the report was the estimated time of death, which the medical examiner placed between midnight and 3 in the morning based on body temperature and rigor mortis progression accounting for the cold, rainy conditions that would have affected decomposition rates. The timeline meant that whoever killed Marcus had done so during the deepest part of night, when most people were asleep and when activity on remote highways would be minimal. It also meant that the body had probably been transported to the disposal site relatively soon after death, within an hour or 2 at most, suggesting the killer either lived nearby or had reasons for wanting to create distance from the actual murder location quickly. Jonas spent the afternoon pulling records related to the property dispute between Marcus and Raymond, reviewing court filings and mediation notes and incident reports that documented the escalating conflict. The picture that emerged was of 2 men who'd started with a disagreement about inherited land and had allowed that disagreement to consume their relationship and poison their interactions until violence became almost inevitable. There were multiple reports of verbal altercations, several instances where witnesses had intervened to prevent physical fights, and the restraining order request that documented Raymond's explicit threats to harm Marcus if he didn't abandon his claim to the disputed property. But documentation of conflict wasn't proof of murder, and Jonas knew that prosecuting Raymond would require more than establishing motive and opportunity. He needed physical evidence, witness testimony, or ideally both that could place Raymond at the crime scene or link him definitively to Marcus's death. The tire tracks at the disposal site were promising but not conclusive. They'd need to be compared against Raymond's truck, and even then would only prove that a similar vehicle had been at the location, not that Raymond had been driving it. The knife wound patterns would need to be matched against any weapons seized from Raymond's property, and that would require warrant based on probable cause that Jonas didn't yet have sufficient evidence to establish. Around 4 o'clock, Jonas received a call from an elder named Thomas Lomahaftewa, who lived in the Fence Lake area, and who'd heard about Marcus's death through the community network that spread information faster than any official channels. Thomas asked if Jonas could come speak with him about something he'd witnessed the previous night, something that might be relevant to the investigation. Jonas agreed immediately and drove back to Fence Lake through rain that had finally begun to ease, the storm breaking up as the weather system moved east and left behind clouds that were thinning enough to allow occasional glimpses of sky. Tomas's home was a traditional dwelling that had been expanded and modernized over the years, but retained the basic structure and orientation that reflected cultural values about how living spaces should be arranged. The elder was in his 70s, a man whose face showed the weathering of decades spent outdoors but whose eyes were sharp and alert with intelligence that age hadn't diminished. He invited Jonas inside and offered coffee that Jonas accepted both because he wanted it and because refusing hospitality would have been culturally inappropriate in ways that could affect the elder's willingness to share information. They sat in Thomas's living room surrounded by family photographs and traditional crafts, and the elder explained what he'd seen the previous night. He'd been unable to sleep due to the storm, a common problem as he aged, and found that weather affected his rest patterns. And he'd been sitting by his window around 1 in the morning when he saw headlights on the road that passed near his property. The road wasn't heavily traveled under normal circumstances, and certainly not during storms in the middle of night, so the vehicle had caught his attention, and he'd watched as it passed slowly heading toward the highway junction. What made the sighting significant was that Thomas recognized the truck as belonging to Raymond Tohany, distinctive because of a dent in the front fender that Raymond had never bothered to repair, and because of the particular sound the engine made that Thomas had heard often enough to identify. The truck had been moving slowly, as though the driver was being careful about road conditions, or didn't want to attract attention, and it had been heading in the direction that would take it toward Highway 17, where Marcus's body was eventually found. Thomas couldn't say definitively whether Raymond had been driving the truck or whether there'd been anyone else in the vehicle, but the timing and direction were consistent with someone who'd just committed murder and was disposing of evidence. Jonas took detailed notes and asked whether Tomas would be willing to provide a formal statement and potentially testify if the case went to trial. The elder considered this carefully before agreeing, explaining that he understood testifying against a family member, even a distant cousin, would create tensions within the community, but that he believed justice was more important than maintaining false peace. The statement wouldn't be sufficient on its own to establish probable cause for arrest warrant, but combined with other evidence, it significantly strengthened the case against Raymond and provided timeline information that would help prosecutors establish opportunity. Jonas spent the evening coordinating with the tribal prosecutor and drafting the warrant application that would allow him to search Raymond's property and vehicle for evidence connecting him to Marcus's death. The process was meticulous and time-consuming, requiring him to document every piece of evidence and witness statement in language that would satisfy a judge's scrutiny, while also being specific enough to define the scope of what could be legally searched and seized. Tomas's eyewitness identification of Raymond's truck traveling toward Highway 17 around the time of death combined with the documented history of threats and violence between the cousins and the physical evidence from the crime scene, created a foundation of probable cause that the prosecutor believed would support the warrant request. The judge who reviewed the application was a tribal court official who'd seen enough violence cases to understand the urgency, while also being careful about protecting constitutional rights that applied on reservation land just as strictly as anywhere else. She approved the warrant around 10 o'clock that evening, with specific limitations about what could be searched and what items could be seized, emphasizing that the authorization extended only to evidence directly related to Marcus's homicide and didn't provide general permission to search for unrelated contraband or violations. Jonas accepted the restrictions, understanding that proper procedure now would prevent defense challenges later if the case proceeded to prosecution and trial. He assembled a team consisting of himself, 2 other tribal officers, and a crime scene technician who'd driven up from Albuquerque specifically for this search. They gathered at the tribal police station around midnight to review the warrant and plan the approach, discussing how they'd secure the property and conduct the search safely while preserving evidence and maintaining proper documentation. The decision was made to execute the warrant at first light rather than during darkness, both because visibility would be better for evidence collection and because approaching during daylight hours reduced the likelihood of confrontation that could turn violent if Raymond felt threatened or trapped. The storm had finally broken completely by the time they drove toward Raymond's property, just after 6 in the morning, the sky clearing to reveal stars that were fading as dawn approached from the east. The air was cold and sharp after the days of rain, probably in the low 40s, and the roads were beginning to dry, though mud still made travel treacherous in places where drainage was poor. Jonas led the convoy with his emergency lights off to avoid alerting Raymond before they were in position, maintaining radio silence except for brief transmissions confirming that all vehicles were maintaining formation and that no one had encountered problems navigating the difficult roads. They arrived at Raymond's property as the first gray light was beginning to define the horizon, parking in positions that blocked the main access road and prevented any vehicles from leaving without going through areas where they'd be immediately intercepted. Jonas approached the house with 2 officers flanking him while the crime scene technician remained at the vehicles preparing equipment that would be needed once the initial entry was secured. He knocked on the door with the firm authority that warrant service required, announcing his identity and purpose in a voice loud enough to be heard throughout the house, but not so aggressive that it would sound like a threat designed to provoke confrontation. Raymond opened the door after perhaps 20 seconds, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt that suggested he'd either been awake already or had dressed quickly after hearing the knocking. His expression when he saw Jonas and the other officers and understood what was happening cycled through surprise and anger before settling into a carefully controlled neutrality that suggested he'd decided cooperation was preferable to resistance, at least until he understood the full scope of what they were doing. Jonas presented the warrant and explained that they would be searching the property and vehicle for evidence related to Marcus Tohany's homicide, giving Raymond the option to remain present during the search or to wait in a designated area under officer supervision. Raymond chose to remain present, following the team as they began the systematic process of documenting and searching the house interior. The search focused initially on areas where weapons might be stored, checking closets and drawers and cabinets for knives or other bladed instruments that could have been used to inflict Marcus's fatal wound. They found several knives in the kitchen, standard culinary tools that showed no obvious signs of having been used as weapons or recently cleaned to remove blood evidence. In Raymond's bedroom, they discovered a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade locked in a drawer, properly stored and showing no visible blood or tissue, but packaged for evidence collection because its dimensions matched the medical examiner's description of the wound characteristics. The bathroom yielded something more significant: a set of clothing wadded into a plastic bag and shoved beneath the sink behind cleaning supplies in a way that suggested concealment rather than normal storage. The clothing consisted of jeans and a flannel shirt, both showing dark stains that could have been blood or could have been any number of other substances, but which field testing with presumptive reagents indicated were likely biological in origin. The items were photographed in place before being carefully removed and packaged for laboratory analysis that would determine whether the stains were actually blood, and if so, whether they matched Marcus's DNA profile. Raymond's demeanor changed when the clothing was discovered, the careful neutrality replaced by visible tension that suggested he understood the implications of what investigators had found. He didn't speak or volunteer any explanations, exercising his right to silence in ways that were legally protected, but which also created inferences that prosecutors would later use to argue consciousness of guilt. Jonas noted the reaction without commenting, focusing on maintaining proper procedure and documentation rather than attempting to elicit statements that Raymond would likely refuse to provide without attorney present. The vehicle search proved equally productive, revealing trace evidence in the truck bed that appeared consistent with someone or something having been transported recently despite efforts to clean the surface. The crime scene technician used specialized lighting to reveal blood spatter patterns that weren't visible to normal observation, finding traces on the truck bed liner and on the interior of the tailgate that suggested bleeding had occurred while the vehicle was stationary or moving slowly. Samples were collected for DNA analysis, and the truck's tires were photographed and measured for comparison against the tracks found at the Highway 17 disposal site. What Jonas found most damning was a small section of fabric caught on a bolt head protruding from the truck bed floor, a piece of material that appeared to match the flannel shirt Marcus had been wearing when his body was found. The fabric showed blood staining and tearing consistent with having been snagged during movement or struggle, and its position suggested that Marcus had been placed in the truck bed at some point during the sequence of events that led to his death. The discovery transformed the evidence from circumstantial to physical, providing a direct link between Raymond's vehicle and the victim that would be extremely difficult to explain away through innocent means. The search of the outbuildings revealed additional items of interest, including cleaning supplies that appeared to have been used recently and discarded in ways that suggested someone trying to eliminate evidence rather than conducting routine maintenance. There were paper towels and rags showing blood-like stains in a trash container, and empty bottles of bleach and hydrogen peroxide that could have been used to clean surfaces or remove biological traces from clothing and equipment. Each item was documented and collected, building a comprehensive evidence package that would allow prosecutors to construct a timeline and narrative of what had occurred on the night Marcus died. By the time the search concluded around noon, Jonas had accumulated enough physical evidence to support arrest in addition to the warrant for search. He contacted the prosecutor who reviewed the findings and authorized immediate arrest on charges of first-degree murder, a decision that reflected confidence that the evidence would support prosecution through trial despite whatever defenses Raymond's attorneys might eventually construct. Jonas read Raymond his rights and placed him in custody, noting that the suspect remained silent throughout the process and showed no visible emotional response beyond a tightening of his jaw muscles that suggested he was working hard to maintain composure. The drive to the detention facility in Grants took approximately 40 minutes, with Raymond secured in the patrol vehicle's rear compartment, and Jonas maintaining professional distance while also watching for any signs that the prisoner might attempt escape or self-harm. They rode in silence broken only by the radio traffic of routine police operations, and Jonas found himself thinking about the family dynamics that had led to this moment, wondering whether the property dispute that had triggered the escalating violence had been worth the price that both Marcus and Raymond would pay for their inability to resolve conflict through means other than confrontation. Eveline was notified of the arrest later that afternoon, and her reaction was a complex mixture of relief that someone was being held accountable for Marcus's death and grief that the person responsible was family member whose own life would now be consumed by criminal prosecution and likely decades of imprisonment. She asked Jonas whether he was certain Raymond had killed Marcus, whether there was any possibility of mistake or misidentification, and he explained the evidence in general terms while respecting the limitations on what he could disclose during ongoing investigation. She accepted his assurance that the case was solid, while clearly struggling with the emotional reality that justice for one family member meant destruction for another. The investigation continued for several weeks, as laboratory results confirmed field findings, and as prosecutors built the comprehensive case that would be presented at trial. The DNA analysis of the blood found on Raymond's clothing and in his truck matched Marcus's genetic profile with statistical certainty that made alternative explanations effectively impossible. The knife seized from Raymond's bedroom showed microscopic traces of blood in the handle seam that had survived cleaning attempts, and that blood also matched Marcus despite the weapon having been wiped down in ways that removed visible evidence. The fabric caught in the truck bed was positively identified as coming from Marcus's shirt, with fiber analysis showing characteristics that were distinctive enough to exclude other potential sources. What emerged from the evidence and from subsequent investigation was a timeline that reconstructed the final hours of Marcus's life with reasonable accuracy, despite the absence of living witnesses willing to testify about what they'd seen. The prosecution's theory, supported by physical evidence and circumstantial factors, was that Raymond had confronted Marcus somewhere near the disputed property late on the night of the killing, that an argument had escalated into physical violence during which Raymond had stabbed Marcus with the hunting knife, and that after Marcus had collapsed from blood loss, Raymond had transported him in the truck bed to Highway 17, where he'd dumped the body in a location calculated to create distance from the actual crime scene. The motive was the property dispute that had consumed both men for months. But the prosecution argued that the immediate trigger had been Marcus's stated intention to file additional legal claims that would have challenged Raymond's use of the land and potentially resulted in partition sale that would benefit neither cousin, but would at least prevent Raymond from claiming exclusive control. Raymond had apparently decided that eliminating Marcus was preferable to continuing the legal battle, a calculation that reflected either rage or cold pragmatism or some combination of both that had led him to commit murder rather than accept outcomes he couldn't control through legitimate means. Raymond maintained his innocence through arraignment and preliminary hearings, his attorney arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that alternative explanations existed for every physical finding that prosecutors presented. The defense theory was that someone else had killed Marcus and had deliberately planted evidence to frame Raymond, exploiting the known conflict between the cousins to create a convenient suspect who had motive and opportunity. It was the kind of defense that created reasonable doubt in some cases, but the sheer volume and consistency of physical evidence made it difficult to construct credible alternative narratives that would explain why Raymond's truck contained Marcus's blood and why Raymond's clothing showed evidence of close contact with the bleeding victim. The trial was scheduled for the following spring, delayed by procedural motions and discovery disputes and the normal grinding slowness of justice systems that prioritized thoroughness over speed. Jonas would be a primary witness, expected to testify about the investigation and the evidence collection and the circumstances that had led to Raymond's arrest. He spent time preparing with prosecutors, reviewing his reports and refreshing his memory about details that would be challenged during cross-examination by defense attorneys looking for any inconsistency or gap that could be exploited to create doubt about the case's strength. But trials were months away, and investigations continued into present tense, and Jonas found himself thinking about aspects of the case that troubled him in ways that had nothing to do with evidence or legal procedure. The family dynamics that had allowed a property dispute to escalate into lethal violence. The community knowledge of escalating tensions that hadn't translated into effective intervention before tragedy occurred. The way that formal legal systems had failed to resolve conflict peacefully, and had instead provided a slow-moving backdrop against which personal grievances had intensified until violence became someone's chosen solution. He visited Thomas several times in the months following Raymond's arrest, partly to maintain contact with a crucial witness, but also because the elder's perspective on the case and its implications for the community provided insights that Jonas couldn't get from official sources. Thomas spoke about the history of the Tohani family, about how the grandfather whose land had sparked the dispute had been a man who'd valued family unity above individual gain, and who would have been devastated to know that his death had created divisions that led to one grandson killing another. The elder emphasized that while Raymond needed to face justice for what he'd done, the community also needed to examine how they'd allowed the situation to deteriorate to the point where murder became a possible outcome that no one had effectively prevented. The conversations left Jonas thinking about the limitations of law enforcement in addressing root causes of violence, the way that police could respond to crimes after they occurred, but struggled to prevent them when prevention required addressing social and economic factors that were beyond the scope of badges and authority. The property dispute that had killed Marcus and would imprison Raymond was itself a symptom of larger issues about inheritance and land use and family communication that no amount of policing could solve, but which created conditions where conflicts became lethal when they might have been resolved through other means if different supports and systems had been available. Eveline moved away from Fence Lake several months after Marcus's death, unable to continue living in a community where everywhere she looked reminded her of her brother, and where family gatherings were now fractured by the reality that one cousin had killed another, and that choosing sides meant betraying someone regardless of where loyalties fell. She stayed in contact with Jonas occasionally, brief emails updating him on her life and asking about the case's progress, and he provided what information he could while respecting the restrictions on discussing ongoing prosecutions. Her grief was complicated by anger and confusion about how the situation had been allowed to reach the point it had, and Jonas had no answers that would satisfy her need to understand why intervention had come too late to save Marcus. The disputed property remained unused, neither family faction willing to work the land that had cost Marcus his life and that had destroyed Raymond's future. It sat empty through seasons of growth and dormancy, grass growing tall and cattle fencing deteriorating from lack of maintenance, a physical monument to the cost of conflict that couldn't be resolved through compromise or communication. Thomas mentioned during one of their conversations that some in the community wanted the land donated to collective use, transformed from source of division into resource that could benefit everyone, and serve as memorial to the importance of choosing peace over possession. Jonas drove past the property sometimes during patrols, looking at the empty acres and thinking about the chain of decisions and circumstances that had led two men to value control of this particular piece of earth more than they valued family relationships or their own futures. The land itself was unremarkable, decent grazing with adequate water access, but nothing exceptional that would justify the intensity of conflict it had generated. What made it valuable was the symbolic importance that the cousins had invested in it, the way it had become proxy for deeper issues about respect and recognition and family hierarchy that might have been negotiated peacefully if either man had been willing to back down before pride became more important than survival. The case file grew thick with supplementary reports and witness statements and expert analyses, hundreds of pages documenting investigation that had been thorough and professional, and had produced results that would likely lead to conviction and lengthy incarceration. Jonas kept a copy on his desk and reviewed it periodically, not because he needed to refresh his memory for testimony, but because it represented something about the nature of his work that he was still processing years into his career. The understanding that solving crimes was necessary but insufficient, that justice for individuals didn't address systemic problems, and that every case file represented failures that extended beyond the specific criminal acts documented in official language. He thought about Marcus sometimes, about the young man who'd refused to abandon his claim to inherited property despite threats and escalating violence, wondering whether that stubbornness reflected courage or foolishness, or simply inability to imagine that family conflict could actually turn lethal. He thought about Raymond sitting in detention awaiting trial, maintaining innocence despite evidence that seemed overwhelming, wondering whether the denial reflected genuine belief in alternative explanations, or calculated legal strategy, or psychological inability to accept responsibility for having killed someone he'd grown up knowing as family. The rain returned the following autumn, another extended storm system that turned roads to mud and made travel dangerous, and created the same conditions that had existed when Marcus's body had been found on Highway 17. Jonas responded to accidents and conducted welfare checks and maintained patrols through weather that made every task more difficult. And he thought about how the landscape shaped the work, and the work shaped the people who did it. The isolation and difficult conditions, and the way that help was always far away. And you learned to handle situations alone because backup might not arrive for hours if it arrived at all. Tomas passed away that winter. Old age and accumulated health problems finally overwhelming a constitution that had endured decades of hard living and weather extremes. Jonas attended the funeral and listened to speeches about the elder's life and contributions, and he thought about the witness statement that Thomas had provided, despite knowing it would create tensions within his community. The courage required to testify against a family member, even when that testimony served justice. The way that doing right things often came with social costs that couldn't be avoided or minimized, regardless of how carefully you proceeded. The trial, when it finally occurred, resulted in conviction on first-degree murder charges, the jury deliberating for less than a day before returning a verdict that reflected their assessment that evidence was overwhelming, and that defense theories about alternative perpetrators were not credible, given the physical and testimonial proof presented. Raymond was sentenced to life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 30 years, a term that meant he would be elderly if he ever regained freedom, and that effectively ended the life he'd known in exchange for the few minutes of violence that had killed Marcus. Jonas testified for several hours during the trial, walking prosecutors and jury through the investigation step by step and explaining the significance of evidence that had been collected and analyzed. Defense attorneys challenged his procedures and conclusions, looking for gaps or inconsistencies that might create reasonable doubt, but the investigation had been thorough enough that their attacks found little purchase. He left the courthouse after his testimony concluded, feeling the familiar emptiness that came from completing major cases, the understanding that justice had been served according to legal definitions, but that the human cost remained uncounted in official tallies. Eveline attended the trial and watched as Raymond was convicted and sentenced, her face showing no satisfaction or triumph, but only the exhausted sadness of someone who'd lost a brother to violence, and now watched another family member consumed by consequences of that violence. She and Jonas spoke briefly in the courthouse hallway afterward, neither finding words adequate to the situation, and then she left to return to whatever life she'd built in the years since Marcus's death. The years accumulated, and the case receded into the background of Jonas's career, still present in files and memories, but no longer commanding daily attention as new investigations demanded response to fresh tragedies and crimes. He remained in the Rama substation, working patrols and investigations and gradually taking on supervisory responsibilities as younger officers joined the force and needed training in how to work the boundary areas, where jurisdiction was complicated and backup was distant, and you learned to trust your instincts because procedure manuals couldn't cover every situation that arose in practice. He drove the roads where Marcus had died and where Raymond had been arrested, and the landscape showed no scars from events that had permanently altered multiple lives. The property that had sparked the conflict remained unused, gradually returning to wild state as vegetation reclaimed areas that had been cleared for grazing, and as structures deteriorated from lack of maintenance. Some in the community spoke about it being cursed, avoided the area in ways that reflected traditional beliefs about places where violence had occurred, while others dismissed such thinking as superstition and saw only empty land that would eventually find new use once enough time had passed. Jonas understood both perspectives and held both in his mind simultaneously. The rational, law enforcement view that treated the property as physical location where crime had occurred and nothing more, and the cultural understanding that places absorbed the events that happened within them and carried those memories in ways that affected people who encountered them afterward. He'd learned during his years on the force that multiple truths could coexist, that the world was more complex than academy training suggested, and that being effective required respecting perspectives that didn't align with official procedures or scientific materialism. The rain came again each autumn, turning roads to mud and creating conditions where travel was dangerous and where bodies could be found in locations where they'd been dumped during darkness by people who thought weather would conceal evidence of their crimes. Jonas responded to each call and worked each case and maintained the careful documentation and thorough investigation that separated successful prosecutions from unsolved files. And he carried with him the knowledge that every case represented failures that extended beyond individual acts of violence to include the systems and circumstances that made such violence possible. He never forgot Marcus or Raymond or the property dispute that had escalated into murder. Never stopped thinking about whether different interventions at earlier points might have prevented the tragedy, or whether the outcome had been inevitable once pride and stubbornness had created conditions where neither man could back down without losing face. The questions had no definitive answers, existed in the realm of speculation rather than evidence, but they shaped how Jonas approached subsequent cases and how he thought about his role in preventing violence rather than simply responding to it after the fact. The boundary roads continued their work of dividing and connecting, and Jonas patrolled them, knowing that beyond his sight and beyond his authority, things were happening that he could affect only marginally, if at all, and that the work required accepting limitations while maintaining effort, understanding that failure was inevitable, while refusing to let inevitability excuse inaction or indifference to the suffering that crimes created in communities that were already struggling with challenges that law enforcement alone could never adequately address.